1,000 miles of American wilderness, and it all ends here. Montana.
Winter, 1883.
Bring her inside, James. Pride won't keep a body warm.
You were given until the first snow, Calloway.
The first snow came early.
Debt has never adjusted itself for weather. A woman with a ledger is still only a woman with a ledger.
And a false claim is still false, even when spoken by a wealthy man.
The ticket slipped from Clara Whitmore's fingers at exactly 4:30 in the afternoon, on the coldest Tuesday she had ever survived. She watched it fall. That small rectangle of paper that represented everything, the train east, Philadelphia, some version of a future she hadn't yet imagined, tumbled end over end through the gray Montana air and disappeared into 3 inches of fresh snow at her feet. She stared at the spot where it had landed. The wind came off the mountains and buried it in seconds. She did not move to retrieve it. There was no point. The train had already gone. The station master had already closed his window. And the next eastbound departure, according to the chalkboard inside the Silver Creek depot, would not arrive for 6 days. 6 days. Clara pressed her hand flat against the front of her coat. A good Philadelphia wool coat, charcoal gray with brass buttons, entirely unsuited for Montana winters, and tried to think. Her mind kept sliding away from the problem like boots on ice. She counted what she had. 1 carpet bag containing 2 dresses, a Bible, a hairbrush, a photograph of her mother, and a small leather coin purse. Inside the purse, 17 cents, a dime, a nickel, 2 pennies, 17 cents and 6 days and nowhere to go. She had known this moment was coming for 3 months. Known it since the morning her mother-in-law, Harriet Whitmore, had stood in the doorway of what had been Clara's bedroom for 4 years and delivered her verdict with the particular cruelty of a woman who had never once doubted her own righteousness. "You could not give my son a child in 4 years of marriage," Harriet had said. Her voice was not loud. Harriet Whitmore never raised her voice. She simply spoke as though her words were gravity itself, inescapable, indifferent to argument. "Robert is gone. You have no place in this family now that he is gone. I have purchased a ticket for you. My cousin in Cheyenne runs a boarding house and may have use for a woman of your particular limitations." Clara had tried to speak. She had tried to explain that the doctor in Philadelphia had said her difficulty was unexplained, not permanent, that Robert had been sick for 2 of their 4 years. That grief was not the same as worthlessness. Harriet had listened to none of it. The cousin in Cheyenne had taken one look at Clara. No references beyond the Whitmore household, no marketable skills, no children as proof of her domestic competence, and had found excuses within the hour. The boarding house was full. Times were difficult. Had she considered going further west? Montana Territory was said to have opportunities for industrious women. Always further, always west, always away. Until she had run out of money and options in Silver Creek, Montana, a settlement that barely qualified as a town. 1 main street, a general store, a saloon, a livery stable, a church with a slightly crooked cross, and a train depot where she now stood as the afternoon light failed and the temperature dropped another 5 degrees. Clara picked up her carpet bag. She turned toward the town. The wind hit her face like an open hand. She found the church first because the church was where she had been told to look. The station master, before he closed his window, had mentioned it with the vague helpfulness of a man who considered his duty discharged by the suggestion. "Reverend Drummond's got a charitable nature," he'd said. Most times. The sign nailed beside the church door read, "Gone to Bozeman, back in God's time." Clara stood on the front steps for a long moment, looking at the sign. Then she set her carpet bag down beside her feet, pulled her coat tighter against the wind, and sat down on the cold stone. She had nowhere else to go. The boarding house the station master had mentioned did not exist. She had already walked the length of the main street twice. The general store was closing. The saloon was not a possibility she was prepared to consider. So she sat on the church steps in the gathering dark of a Montana winter afternoon and looked at the snow falling on a street where she knew no one, and for the first time since Robert died, the first time since she had stood dry-eyed at his funeral while his mother watched her from across the grave, Clara allowed herself to cry. Not the respectable kind, not the quiet, controlled grief she had performed for Harriet Whitmore's benefit. This was something that came from somewhere lower and older, from the part of her that had been told she was worthless and had half believed it, that had been told she was barren and had carried the word like a stone in her chest for 3 months, that had traveled 2,000 miles on the charity of people who did not want her, and was now sitting on a church step with 17 cents in a town whose name she could barely remember. She cried until she couldn't anymore. Then she sat in the cold and listened to the wind. That was when she heard the wagon. It came from the north end of the street, 2 horses, a flatbed supply wagon with wooden side rails moving at a steady pace that suggested a man who knew exactly where he was going and how long it was going to take him to get there. The driver sat tall even in the seat, which was a thing Clara noticed without quite meaning to. He wore a dark coat and a hat pulled low, and beside him sat 2 children, a girl with her spine absolutely straight despite the cold, and a smaller boy pressed against the man's side for warmth. The wagon stopped in front of the building across the street. Not a restaurant exactly, but a structure with a lamp burning in the window and a hand-lettered sign that said meals. The man helped both children down with a careful economy of motion, his hands gentle despite their size. Then he paused. He turned and he looked directly at Clara. She should have looked away. She was aware of how she must appear. A woman sitting alone on church steps in a blizzard, clearly crying, clearly out of place in her Philadelphia coat and her Philadelphia shoes. She should have manufactured some expression of composure. She did not. She was too tired to manufacture anything. The man looked at her for a moment. Then he said across the wind and the empty street, "Ma'am, you all right?" The question was so simply and genuinely meant that it nearly started her crying again. She pressed her lips together. "I'm fine," she said. He studied her the way a man studies something he doesn't quite believe. His eyes were a particular shade of gray, the color of the sky just before a storm commits to itself. And they were the eyes of someone who had seen enough of the world to know when he was being lied to. "You don't look fine," he said. "You look like a woman sitting on church steps in a blizzard with nowhere to go." "My business is my own, sir." Something shifted in his expression. It might have been respect. He turned back toward the building where his children had already gone inside. Then the small boy pushed the door back open and pulled on the man's coat and said something too quiet for Clara to hear. The man shook his head. The boy said something else. The man's jaw tightened in a way that suggested he was being argued with by someone considerably smaller than himself, and that this was not an unusual occurrence. He came back across the street. He stopped at the bottom of the church steps and removed his hat, which was the kind of gesture that belonged to an older courtesy. His hair was dark and needed cutting. His face was weathered in the particular way of men who spent their lives outdoors. Not aged but carved, as though the Montana wind had been working on him for years. "My name is James Calloway," he said. "I run the Diamond Sea Ranch about 8 miles north of here. I came into town for supplies," and he paused as though measuring his words before he spent them. "And to speak with Reverend Drummond if I could find him." "He's in Bozeman," Clara said. "The sign says so. I can read." His voice was dry but not unkind. "The point is, I was looking for him because I needed to ask him something, whether he knew any women in the area who might be looking for work." His gaze dropped briefly to her carpet bag. "Housekeeping, cooking, looking after children." Clara's chest tightened. She said nothing. "My wife died 7 years ago," he said. "Childbirth. I've been managing on my own since then." He glanced toward the building where his children had disappeared. "I'm not managing well. You're offering me employment." "Might be. If you're capable." "I can cook," Clara said. "I can clean. I managed a household in Philadelphia for 4 years." "Philadelphia." He said it the way people in Montana said Philadelphia, as though it explained a great many things, most of them concerning. "City woman." The old anger came up in her, clean and familiar. "Just because I'm from the city does not mean I am incapable of hard work." "Didn't say you were incapable. Said you were from the city." "That's a fact, not an accusation." "Then what is it?" "A concern." He shifted his weight, and she noticed for the first time that he favored his left leg slightly, the particular economy of motion of a man working around an old injury. Frontier life isn't managing a Philadelphia household. It's no running water, no gas lamps, no neighbors for miles. It's work from before dawn to after dark every single day until you fall into bed too tired to think. His gray eyes held hers steadily. "I've watched it kill women who thought they were prepared." "I'm not afraid of work," Clara said. "Everyone says that. I mean it." He looked at her for a long moment. She looked back. She was aware that she had been crying not 20 minutes ago and that her eyes probably showed it. And she was aware that she has 17 cents in 6 days and no alternatives. And she held his gaze anyway. "You running from something?" he asked. "Law, debts, a man. I'm running from a life that ended when my husband died." The words came out harder than she intended. "His family told me I was worthless because I couldn't give him children in 4 years of marriage. They put me on a stage west with nothing. I ran out of money here." James Calloway was quiet for a moment. Snow was accumulating on the brim of the hat he still held in his hands. Then he said, "There's something I need to tell you before we go any further. Something that's going to sound improper. Say it anyway." He did not look away from her. "I don't just need a housekeeper." She waited. "I have a neighbor," he said. "Victor Hargrove. He runs the largest cattle operation in this part of the territory. For 3 years, he's been trying to force me to sell my land or unite our properties through a marriage between me and his daughter, Vivienne." He paused. "I've refused. So he's moved to the water rights. There's a creek that runs through both our properties. Diamond Creek, which is how my ranch got its name. The water agreement between our families goes back 30 years, but the original documents are ambiguous enough that Hargrove's lawyers have found room to challenge them. If he takes this to a territorial court before I can demonstrate I have a stable household and a clear business succession, I'm going to lose that agreement. And without that water, I lose the ranch itself." Clara heard the weight under the words. This was not a man making a simple business proposition. This was a man describing the edge he was standing on. "So you need a wife," she said. "Not a housekeeper. I need both." He said it plainly, without apology. "I need someone who can manage the house and help with my children." And I need to present to Victor Hargrove and to whatever judge he brings in that I am a man with a settled household and no reason to accommodate his ambitions. He met her eyes. What I'm proposing is a legal marriage. Not the romantic kind. A partnership. You get a home, security, protection from whatever you're running from. I get someone to help hold what my father built. You're asking me to marry you, Clara said. We have been speaking for less than 20 minutes. I'm aware of that. You don't know my name. He almost smiled. It was a small thing, barely visible, but it was there. You told me. Whitmore. Clara Whitmore from Philadelphia. That is not the point. I know it isn't. He put his hat back on. The point is that we are both in desperate situations, and sometimes two desperate situations solve each other. I'm not pretending this is something it isn't. I'm not asking you to pretend either. Clara stood up. She was not a tall woman, but she had always had a quality of stillness when she rose that made people pay attention. What would you expect from me? She asked. In this arrangement, honest work, help with the house and my children. Respect, he paused, separate sleeping arrangements. I gave my word to my first wife on our wedding day, and I will give my word to you. I will not touch you in any way you don't consent to. This would be a marriage on paper and in practical terms. Nothing further, unless at some point down the line we both decided otherwise. And if it doesn't work, then I'll see you to wherever you want to go with enough money to start fresh. His voice was level. You have my word on that too. Clara looked past him at the street. The snow was falling harder now, the kind that meant business, the kind that didn't stop for considerations of human convenience or human dignity. She thought about the train that didn't come for 6 days. She thought about 17 cents. She thought about Harriet Whitmore's voice, so calm, so final. You have no place in this family now. I have conditions, she said. He raised an eyebrow. I will not be treated as an employee in my own household. If we do this, I am your partner in the running of that ranch, not a woman following orders. Agreed. Your children. I won't try to replace their mother, but I will not be treated as a servant in front of them, and I need your support when they challenge my authority. Because they will challenge it. I expect they will. His voice was entirely serious. Especially Eliza. One more thing. Clara's voice was steady, though something in her chest was not. If we do this, we do it properly. Real vows, real ceremony before a man of God. I won't have people looking at me as a desperate woman who trapped you into something shameful. Whatever this arrangement is, it begins with honesty and with dignity. He extended his hand. It was a large hand, scarred at the knuckles, the hand of a man who worked hard and had worked hard for a very long time. You have a deal, Miss Whitmore, he said. She looked at his hand for 3 seconds. Then she took it. His grip was warm and certain, and something about the warmth was the most startling thing that had happened to her all day. They went inside to find his children. The girl, Eliza, 11 years old, with her father's gray eyes and a jaw set with a determination that went well beyond her age, looked at Clara with an expression that contained no welcome whatsoever. She sat at the table with her hands folded in front of her and said nothing. She did not have to. Every line of her body said it clearly enough. The boy Owen was 7. He had dark eyes that held a quality of watchfulness that did not belong to a 7-year-old, the eyes of a child who had learned early to pay attention to the temperature of a room. He had his thumb in his mouth, which he removed when he noticed Clara noticing it, with the self-consciousness of a boy who knew he was too old for the habit, but hadn't quite managed to stop. Papa, Eliza said. Her voice was controlled in the way of someone very young performing a great deal of control. Who is she? This is Clara Whitmore, James said. He sat down across from his daughter and spoke to her straight, which Clara noted. He did not soften it or distract from it. She's going to come back to the ranch with us. I've asked her to marry me. The silence that followed was the kind that has weight. You can't, Eliza said. Her voice cracked on the second word, and she sealed the crack immediately, the way a person seals a wound they don't want anyone to see. You promised. You said nobody would ever take Mama's place. Nobody is taking your mother's place, James said. Your mama was your mama, and she always will be. But Eliza, we need help. You know we do. I can handle it. You're 11 years old. I've been handling it since I was 8. I know you have. And that is not something I'm proud of. He leaned forward. That's something I should have fixed a long time ago. Eliza's eyes were very bright. She will leave, she said. She'll leave just like Mama left. Everyone leaves. Your mama didn't leave, James said quietly. She died. There's a difference. It doesn't feel different. Owen had been watching all of this from his place at the edge of the bench. Now he slid off the seat and walked over to Clara with the careful deliberation of a small person making a large decision. He looked up at her with those dark, watchful eyes. Will you read to us? He asked. Mama used to read to us before he stopped. Before, yes, Clara said. I'll read to you. Will you make breakfast? Yes. Papa burns everything, James said Owen. It's true, Owen said without particular apology. He looked back up at Clara. Will you stay? It was such a simple question, and it contained such a weight of history, that Clara had to take a breath before she could answer it. I can't promise I won't die someday, she said carefully. Nobody can promise that, but I can promise I won't choose to leave, that I will stay for as long as I'm needed and wanted. That is the truest promise I can make you. Owen considered this for a long moment, then he nodded once, with the gravity of someone ratifying a treaty. Eliza said nothing. She stared at the table with her jaw still set, and her hands still folded, and Clara did not push her. There were things that could not be rushed. Eliza's grief was one of them. They rode to Bozeman through a storm that seemed to take the proposal personally. The snow came sideways for much of the journey, and Clara sat in the bed of the wagon under a blanket James had wordlessly handed her, watching Montana territory disappear into white nothing in every direction. Eliza sat up front beside her father, rigid and silent. Owen sat beside Clara, pressed against her side for warmth, and told her in a low voice about his horse, a brown and white paint named Copper, and about the barn cat who had kittens every spring, and about the creek that froze in winter so solid you could walk across it. He talked the way children talk when they are nervous and trying not to show it, constantly, about everything, covering the silence with words the way you cover a wound with cloth. "Are you really going to marry Papa?" he asked at one point. "Yes," Clara said. "How come?" She thought about several answers. "Because I have nowhere else to go. Because your father offered me something when no one else would. Because 17 cents is not enough to survive a Montana winter, and I am not ready to surviving. Because he asked," she said instead. "And because I think we might be able to help each other. Eliza says you're using Papa for his money." That's what she said when Papa was talking to the horses. "She said you were using Papa. I'm not using your father," Clara said. "I don't want his money. I want a home. Those are different things." "What's the difference?" "Money you take and leave with." Clara looked out at the white world passing. "A home is something you build and stay for." Owen thought about this for the remainder of the journey, which was another hour and a half, and did not raise the question again, which suggested he had found the answer satisfactory. They found Reverend Caleb Drummond at a boarding house in Bozeman, warming himself beside a fire in the common room with the contentment of a man who had discharged his duties for the day and was not planning to pick them back up until morning. He was a large man running to softness, with a white beard trimmed close and the kind of face that had clearly laughed a great deal in its life. He looked up when they came in, 2 children, a rancher and a woman in a city coat who looked like she had been crying recently, and said nothing for a moment. Then, "James Calloway, what in God's name brings you out in this weather?" Drummond rose from his chair and extended his hand, looking between the children and the stranger with the alert curiosity of a man whose profession required him to notice things. "Need you to perform a ceremony, Reverend," James said. "Tonight, if you're willing." Drummond's eyebrows traveled toward his hairline. He asked to speak with Clara alone in the small study off the common room, among shelves of books and the smell of candle wax and old paper. He looked at her directly. "Are you being coerced, Mrs. Whitmore?" "No. You understand this marriage will be legally binding." "Yes, and you understand what you're walking into. An isolated ranch, 2 children who aren't yours, a man you met this afternoon. I understand all of it." Clara kept her voice level. "And I'm choosing it anyway." "Why?" "Because the alternative is worse." She said it plainly, without self-pity. "I have no money and no family and nowhere to go. Mr. Calloway is offering me a chance to be useful again, to matter to someone. That may not be what people mean when they talk about marriage, but it's honest." Drummond was quiet for a moment. "And love?" he asked gently. "Child marriage ought to be built on more than utility." "I had love," Clara said. "I loved my husband and believed we had a lifetime ahead of us. He died and his family threw me out because I couldn't give him children." She met the Reverend's eyes. "Love didn't protect me. Maybe honest arrangements are more truthful than romantic ones. That's a hard philosophy for someone your age. It's the one I'm living with." Drummond looked at her for a long moment. Then he stood. "All right, Mrs. Whitmore, if this is your choice, but I want you to hear something before we proceed." She waited. "Vows are sacred whether they're spoken from love or from necessity," he said. "Once you make this commitment, you are bound to this man and to those children in the eyes of God. That is not something to step into lightly." "I'm not stepping into it lightly," Clara said. "I'm stepping into it seriously." "Maybe that's better." "Maybe it is," he said. "Maybe it is." The ceremony was brief and practical, performed in the boarding house parlor with the 2 children as witnesses. Owen stood at Clara's side with his hands clasped together and his face solemn as a deacon's. Eliza stood on the far side of her father with her spine straight and her eyes fixed somewhere above the Reverend's head, not refusing to watch, exactly, but not conceding to watch either. Reverend Drummond read the vows by lamplight. When he asked Clara if she took this man, her voice shook on the words. She steadied it and said them. James's voice did not shake. He said his vows with the same careful precision he seemed to apply to everything, as though each word were a promise he intended to keep track of. "You may kiss your bride," Drummond said. James leaned down. He was considerably taller than Clara, a fact she had noted abstractly and now felt more concretely, and pressed a brief, entirely proper kiss to her lips. It was over in a second and a half. It was enough to make everything irrevocable. She was married again, to a stranger. In Montana, in a blizzard, they signed the marriage certificate in the Reverend's careful handwriting. Clara Whitmore became Clara Calloway in the space of a signature. Owen leaned against her arm and watched the pen move. Eliza watched the window. Outside, the snow had not let up. The ride back to the ranch took 3 hours. The storm was serious now, and James drove with his full attention on the horses and the road, which was disappearing under fresh snow at a rate that suggested they were making this journey at approximately the last possible moment. Owen fell asleep against Clara's side. She put her arm around him without thinking about it, and he settled into the shelter of her arm with the absolute trust of a sleeping child. And Clara sat in the wind and the dark with someone else's sun warm against her side and tried to understand what she had done. The Diamond Sea Ranch appeared at the far edge of the lamplight as a collection of dark shapes against white. Main house, barn, outbuildings, all of them solid and low and built to endure. She had expected something more provisional. This was not provisional. This was a place that had been standing for a long time and intended to keep standing. A woman emerged from the house before the wagon fully stopped. She was in her 60s, tall and angular, with iron gray hair pulled back severely and the kind of face that had stopped pretending to be surprised by anything some decades ago. She stood on the porch with her hands on her hips and looked at them as they pulled up. "About time," she said. "Children need their beds." She looked at Clara. "Who's this?" James helped Owen down from the wagon. The boy woke briefly, mumbled something, and was asleep again almost before his feet hit the ground. Eliza climbed down herself. "This is Clara," James said. "My wife." The woman's expression did not change, but something behind her eyes went very still. "Your wife. We were married this evening, in Bozeman, by Reverend Drummond." Married this evening, she looked at Clara the way a woman looks at something she's trying to classify. "Married this evening to a woman you met this afternoon, I'll wager." James said. Dorothea Briggs, the woman said to Clara. She said it as an introduction, not a concession. "I've cooked and cleaned for this ranch since James's father was alive." She paused. "We will be talking tomorrow, James." "We will," he agreed. Dot stepped aside and let them into the house. Inside was warm and plain and lived in. A main room with a large stone fireplace and a table long enough to seat 8. Bookshelves along one wall with a mixture of ledgers and actual books. A rocking chair by the hearth with a piece of mending draped over one arm. Everything clean but arranged with the particular disorder of a household that had been running without a woman's organizing intelligence. Things pushed to the edges, spaces not quite used, a kind of functional disorder that said, "We are getting by." Dot took Owen to his bed and came back. She led Clara upstairs without ceremony, down a short hallway to a door at the end. She opened it. The room was beautiful, in the way of something that had been beautiful and was now waiting. Lace curtains at the window, a handmade quilt on the bed in deep blues and creams, a vanity with a silver-backed brush and mirror set arranged on its surface. But a fine layer of dust lay over everything, and the air smelled closed and old, and there was a quality to the room that Clara felt before she understood it. This space had not been disturbed in a very long time. This was Catherine Calloway's room. Dot said it quietly, standing in the doorway behind her. "He hasn't let anyone touch it since she died. 7 years. She paused. "You'll be the first." Clara stood in the middle of the room and looked at the silver brush set on the vanity. She said, "What was she like?" Dot was quiet for a moment. "Delicate," she said finally. "Beautiful. She wanted very badly to be what this life needed, and she tried hard to be it. But she wasn't built for it. The isolation wore at her. Every winter she got a little quieter, a little further away. By the time the boy was coming, she was already..." Dot stopped. Clara waited. "The childbirth just finished what Montana had already started," Dot said. "But before you go thinking James Calloway is a man who didn't love his wife. He loved her. He just couldn't keep her alive with it." Clara looked at the dust on the vanity. She looked at the quilt on the bed, made by hands she would never know. "There's one more thing you should know," Dot said. Her voice had gone quieter. "The reason Catherine died wasn't an accident of nature. She knew the risk. The doctor told her, told both of them, that another pregnancy would kill her. She got pregnant anyway, because Eliza wanted a sister, because Eliza was 4 years old and kept asking for a sister, and Catherine couldn't say no to her." Clara turned to look at her. "James found her when she was already dying," Dot said. "He held her hand until it was over. The last thing she said to him was, 'I'm sorry.' You never did figure out what she was apologizing for, and I think not knowing has been its own kind of wound all these years." After Dot left, Clara sat on the edge of the bed, Catherine's bed, her bed now, and listened to the wind against the window. She thought about a woman who had known she might die and had made her choice anyway. She thought about a man who had been living inside that choice for 7 years, carrying a question that had no answer. She thought about 17 cents on a snow-covered platform and a hand extended across a blizzard, and a word that had changed everything. Yes. She had said yes. She lay down on Catherine Calloway's quilt without undressing, because she was too tired to do anything else, and she was asleep before she could think another thought. She woke to the sound of a child crying. The room was dark, the wind had died. The house was quiet except for that sound, a small, desolate sound coming from somewhere down the hall, and Clara was on her feet and moving toward it before she was fully awake. Owen's door was open a crack. She pushed it wider. He was sitting up in bed in the lamplight, shaking. His eyes were open but not quite present, still half caught in whatever had hold of him. When she came in and sat on the edge of his bed, he flinched slightly, then focused on her face. "Mama," he said. His voice was barely a sound. "I'm here," Clara said. She put her hand on his back, and he was shaking under her palm like something running too fast. "You're safe, you're home." "She was drowning," he said. "Mama was drowning and I couldn't reach her." He pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes. "Papa said it was my fault," he said. He didn't finish. Clara looked up and found Eliza standing in the doorway, white-faced, having heard. "Out," Clara said quietly to the girl. Her voice was not unkind. But it was not a suggestion. Eliza went. Clara sat with Owen until his breathing steadied. She did not tell him it was just a dream because she did not know what it was, and she would not lie to him. She told him he was safe. She told him he was home. She told him that whatever had happened to his mother was not his fault, that babies were not responsible for the circumstances of their own arrival into the world, that no child had ever caused the death of a parent simply by being born. He cried. She held him through it. When he finally fell asleep again, she went to find Eliza. The girl was in her room, sitting by the window in the dark, looking out at the snow-covered ranch. She did not turn when Clara came in. "I know you're frightened," Clara said. "I'm not going to pretend you're not." "I didn't mean for him to hear it," Eliza said. Her voice was controlled and small. "I said it a long time ago. I didn't think he still remembered. He still has nightmares about it every night." "Silence. Eliza," Clara said. "I want you to hear something. Not because it will fix everything, but because it's true. Your mother didn't die because your brother was born. She died because of a medical complication during a very difficult birth, and those are two entirely different things. One is biology, the other is blame, and 7-year-old boys should not be carrying blame for things that happened before they could speak. Somebody has to be responsible," Eliza said. Her voice was barely a whisper. "Bad things don't just happen. Someone has to have caused it. Sometimes bad things do just happen," Clara said. "Sometimes there's no one to blame and no way to explain it, and all that's left is the loss itself." She sat down on the floor near the window, putting herself below Eliza's eye level. "Your mother made a choice, a brave, maybe a foolish choice, made from love. It had consequences, but Owen was not the consequence. Owen was the whole reason for the choice. She loved him before he existed. Do you understand that?" Eliza was quiet for a long time. "I'm scared," she finally said. Her voice dropped to something younger and softer. "I'm scared you'll leave like Mama did. I'm scared Papa will die too. I'm scared I'll start to care about you and then you'll be gone and I'll have to start all over again." Clara looked at the girl's profile against the dark window. She thought about a 4-year-old who had asked for a sister and lost her mother instead. And she thought about what 7 years of carrying that knowledge silently would do to a person still growing into herself. "Come here," she said. "I don't want to. I know. Come anyway." Eliza came. She crossed the room and stood in front of Clara stiffly, braced for something, and Clara put her arms around the girl and held on. Eliza's spine stayed rigid for perhaps 10 seconds. Then it didn't. She cried like she had been saving it for a long time. Clara held her and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that was better than silence, and because some grief needs to come out before it can be talked about. It needs to move through a person before a person can move forward. When it was over, Eliza pulled back and wiped her face roughly, clearly embarrassed by it. "I'm still not calling you Mama," she said. "I'm not asking you to, and I still think this whole thing is probably a terrible idea. You might be right about that." Eliza looked at her with something that was not quite trust, but was at least the consideration of trust. Then she went back to her bed and lay down without another word. Clara stood in the doorway of the girl's room and looked at the sleeping shape of her and thought, "All right then, this is where I am." She went back to Catherine's room. She lay down on Catherine's quilt. She listened to the Montana wind pick up again outside the window, and she thought about tomorrow, about all the tomorrows lined up ahead of her in this place she did not know, among people who did not know her, in a life she had not planned and could not fully imagine. She thought about what Dot had said. He never did figure out what she was apologizing for. And she thought about James Calloway standing at the bottom of church steps in a blizzard with his hat in his hands, extending a proposition that was rational and cold and completely honest. And she thought about saying yes, and she thought that maybe sometimes desperation and honesty were not so different from each other after all, that sometimes they arrived at the same place by different roads. And she closed her eyes. In the room at the end of the hall, a lamp burned until nearly morning. James's lamp, she would realize later, in the small office where he had retreated when he gave his first wife's room to a woman he had married that afternoon. He was awake a long time, so was she. The next morning came gray and cold and full of everything that had not yet happened, and Victor Hargrove rode in just after breakfast. He came with 2 men behind him on large horses, and he sat his own horse with the ease of a man who has sat horses his whole life and knew exactly what it communicated about his standing in the world. He was perhaps 55, with silver at his temples and the kind of face that had been handsome once and had cured into something harder. He wore a good coat. His boots were expensive. He looked at Clara with the particular attention of a man assessing something he considers a variable in an equation he is solving. "Mrs. Calloway," he said. His voice was smooth and interested, the way a man's voice is when he is deciding how dangerous a thing is. "I'd heard about you." He paused. 4 years of marriage, I understand. In Philadelphia. No children. Clara looked back at him without moving. "Calloway here must have been quite desperate," Hargrove said, almost pleasantly. "To take on a woman other men have found wanting." Something cold moved through Clara. Not fear, or not only fear. Something older and harder than fear. The same thing that had kept her upright on those church steps when she had every reason to fold. She said, "You've ridden 8 miles in the cold to discuss my previous marriage, Mr. Hargrove. That seems like a great deal of effort to manage someone else's business." His eyes sharpened. A flicker of reassessment crossed his face, quick as a shadow. "I'm here to congratulate my neighbor on his recent good fortune," he said, "and to introduce myself to his bride." He smiled, and it did not reach his eyes. "I also want her to understand the situation she's married into. The water rights between our properties are a matter before the territorial court. James knows this. I'll be watching this new household closely, Mrs. Calloway. Very closely." He looked at James. "You'd have saved us all a great deal of trouble if you'd just accepted my offer, Calloway." James said nothing. His jaw was set. Hargrove turned his horse. As he did, he looked at Clara one more time with the calculating patience of a man who knows he has time and intends to use all of it. "Welcome to Silver Creek, Mrs. Calloway," he said. "I do hope you're as capable as you appear to believe." He rode away with his 2 men behind him, and the sound of hooves on frozen ground faded north into silence. Clara stood in the cold and watched him go. She felt James come to stand beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him despite the temperature. "He'll challenge the marriage," she said. "Yes," James said. "He'll say it's fraudulent, that we did it to undermine his legal position." "Yes." She turned to look at James. His face was set in the same careful lines she was beginning to recognize as his resting expression. The face of a man who had learned to manage what he felt so that the feeling didn't manage him. "Then we'll have to make sure he can't prove it," she said. James looked at her. The gray eyes were steady and complicated and held something she was only beginning to learn how to read. "Yes," he said. "We will." The wind came off the mountains and swept across the yard of the Diamond Sea Ranch, rattling the barn door and lifting a curl of snow from the roof of the house. Clara pulled her Philadelphia coat tighter and made a mental note to find something warmer. There was a great deal of work ahead. She intended to be equal to it. The first week at Diamond Sea Ranch was an education in humility. Clara had believed herself capable. She had managed a Philadelphia household. 4 rooms, a cook who came 3 days a week, a laundress who came on Mondays, gas lamps that lit with a match and stayed lit without tending. She had believed that what she knew would translate. It did not translate. The wood stove was the first thing that defeated her. It was a massive iron creature that occupied the center of the kitchen wall and had opinions about everything. The type of wood, the arrangement of the kindling, the precise angle of the damper. On her first morning, she built a fire that produced more smoke than heat and filled the kitchen with a gray haze that sent Dot Briggs out the back door, muttering things Clara chose not to hear clearly. On her second morning, she built a fire that burned too hot and scorched the bottom of the coffee pot. On her third morning, she built a fire that went out entirely while she had her back turned, and she stood in the cold kitchen at 5 in the morning with a dead stove and uncooked eggs and a growing suspicion that the frontier was not going to accommodate her on principle. Dot came in and rebuilt the fire without a word. She did it with the efficiency of someone who had done it 10,000 times, her hands moving through the motions without any apparent thought. Then she stood back and looked at Clara. "You want to learn or you want to feel sorry for yourself?" she asked. Clara set her jaw. "I want to learn, then watch, and stop apologizing for not knowing things you've never been taught." So Clara watched. She watched the way Dot managed the damper, the particular combination of hardwood and kindling, the way the fire needed to breathe. She watched how Dot stretched a pound of salt pork into meals that fed the ranch hands and left them satisfied. She watched how Dot read the weather from the color of the morning sky and adjusted the day's work accordingly. What needed to be done inside, what could wait, what couldn't wait at all. She watched everything, and she asked questions, and she made mistakes, and she did not make the same mistake twice. Her hands told the story of that first week. By Friday, they were red and cracked from the cold water she hauled from the well, the lye soap, the rough work that had no equivalent in Philadelphia. By the following Monday, they had blistered, and the blisters had broken and were healing into something harder. By the ends of the second week, her hands did not look like Philadelphia hands anymore. They looked like hands that were learning what work actually meant and finding they were capable of it. Owen followed her everywhere. He had decided with the complete commitment that only small children are capable of, that Clara was to be trusted. He had made this decision on the strength of one night of nightmare soothing and one honest conversation about promises, and he did not revisit it. He simply attached himself to her presence the way a small boat ties to a dock, as though proximity to her was its own form of safety. He talked constantly. He told her about Copper the horse and the particular way Copper liked his ears scratched. He told her about the kittens in the barn. There were 5 of them, and he had named all 5 and could explain at length why each name was correct. He told her about a boy at the schoolhouse in Silver Creek named Frederick, whose father ran the general store, and who had punched Owen in the shoulder last September for a reason Owen could not now fully reconstruct, but which had seemed significant at the time. He told her about his mother, in the casual, matter-of-fact way that children talk about things they have processed into ordinary life. "Mama used to keep dried flowers on the windowsill," he would say, or Mama could whistle louder than Papa, just offering these facts like small gifts, not asking for anything in return. Clara received each one carefully. Eliza kept her distance but stopped actively making war. This was a meaningful distinction. In the first days, Eliza had made her feelings known through a series of small, calculated resistances, arriving late to meals Clara had prepared, leaving tasks half-finished that she knew Clara would need to complete, responding to Clara's questions with the minimum possible number of words. Not defiant enough to bring her father's correction down on her, just enough to establish clearly that cooperation was not the same as acceptance. Clara did not fight it. She had understood something on the night of Owen's nightmare, sitting on the floor of Eliza's room while the girl finally cried. Eliza was not cruel. She was terrified. And cruelty would have been straightforward to address, but terror required something different. Terror required patience and time and the willingness to be rejected repeatedly without withdrawing. So Clara was patient. She assigned Eliza tasks that were real and necessary, not invented to keep her busy. She asked Eliza's opinion on household decisions and then actually used the information. She did not crowd Eliza's grief or pretend it didn't exist. She simply continued to show up every day, doing the work, and she waited. James was the most complicated. They had established a careful domestic arrangement in those first weeks. Functional, polite, scrupulous, respectful of the boundaries they had both agreed to. They spoke at meals about ranch business, about the children's needs, about the weather and the cattle and the 1,000 practical matters of running a frontier property. They passed each other in doorways with the calibrated courtesy of two people who were both trying very hard to be considerate of a situation neither of them had fully anticipated. At night, James retreated to the small office off the main room where he had set up a cot, and Clara slept in Catherine's room, and the house settled into its nightly quiet, and Clara would lie awake sometimes and listen to the wind and think about the particular strangeness of being legally bound to a man whose sleeping face she had never seen. She caught him watching her sometimes, not in a way that made her uncomfortable, in a way that suggested he was paying attention, processing something, arriving at conclusions he was not yet ready to speak aloud. She suspected she was watching him the same way. James Calloway at work was a different man than James Calloway at rest. At rest he was contained, measured, giving away very little. At work he was entirely present, with the horses, with the cattle, with the ranch hands who clearly respected him without requiring warmth from him. He had a gift for silence that communicated more than most men's words. He could settle a nervous horse with a hand on its neck and a particular quality of stillness that seemed to flow from him outward into the animal. Clara watched this once from the barn doorway in the third week. James standing with a young horse that had spooked at something, one hand on its jaw, not speaking, just being fully present with it until the animal's breathing slowed and its head dropped. And she thought, he does this with the children too. He offers his steadiness as a resource. He just doesn't know how to do it with words. It was on an evening at the end of the third week that the words finally came. She had gone to the kitchen for water after the household was asleep and found a lamp burning in the office. She stopped at the doorway. James was sitting at his desk with a ranch ledger open in front of him, but he was not looking at it. He was looking at something she could not see. She should have gone back to bed. She did not. "Can I come in?" she asked. He looked up. He seemed neither surprised nor unwelcoming. He simply gestured at the chair across from his desk, the way he gestured at things he meant to be practical, and she sat down. She said, "Tell me about Catherine." Something moved across his face. He looked down at the ledger, then he closed it and pushed it aside with the deliberateness of a man making room for something. "She was not like you," he said. His voice was careful, as though he was picking his way across uncertain ground. "She was gentle. She saw the best in everything and everyone. She wanted this life to be beautiful, and she worked very hard to make it so." He paused, but she wasn't built for it. The isolation wore on her. Every winter she got quieter further away. "I thought it was just the weather. I told myself every spring she'd come back to herself, and every spring she mostly did, and I told myself that was enough." Clara said nothing. She waited. "The doctor told us clearly," James continued. "After Owen's birth, before Owen's birth, he told us another pregnancy would likely kill her. He said it in plain terms that left no room for misunderstanding." He paused. "I thought we understood each other. I thought we had agreed on what that meant for us. And then Eliza came to me one evening. She was wearing her Sunday dress for no reason I could understand at the time, which should have told me something, and said that Mama had something to tell me." "What did you say?" Clara asked. He was quiet for a moment. Catherine was sitting at the kitchen table with her hands folded in front of her the way she folded them when she had made a decision she knew I wouldn't like. She told me she was 4 months along, and she was smiling. I remember thinking, she has been carrying this secret for 4 months, and what she looks is relieved. Not afraid. Relieved, as though telling me was the hard part, and dying was something she hadn't quite made room for yet. He stopped. "I said everything you would say to a person you love who has just told you they may have signed their own death warrant," I begged her. She listened to all of it, and then she said, "Eliza needs a sister." She said she would be careful. She said God would provide. Clara kept her voice steady. "And you?" "I went out to the barn," he said, "and I stood there in the cold for a long time, and I decided that if I could not change her mind, I would at least keep her as safe as I possibly could and hope that the doctor had been wrong about the risk." His voice went flat and tight. The doctor was not wrong. The labor lasted 3 days. Owen came out fine, healthy, perfect. Catherine lived another 6 hours after. She died just before dawn. Her last words were, "I'm sorry, and I have been trying to figure out what she meant by that for 7 years." Clara felt the grief in the room like a physical presence. Not her grief, his and his daughter's, and even Owen's, who had never had the chance to know what he was grieving. She said, "Eliza has been telling herself she caused it." James's jaw clenched. "I know. You've known, yes. And you haven't spoken to her about it." The silence stretched, finally. "No." Clara leaned forward. "James, you've known your daughter has been carrying that for 7 years, and you chose not to speak to her about it." "I didn't know how," he said. His voice was very controlled, and underneath the control was something ragged. "I didn't know what to say. Every time I looked at her, I saw Catherine's face, and I couldn't." He stopped. Clara looked at him for a long moment. She understood then what she had not fully understood before. It was not that James Calloway was an unfeeling man. It was that he felt too much and had found, after Catherine died, that the only way to survive it was to stop letting himself feel anything he couldn't immediately use. His steadiness was not natural. It was constructed. Brick by brick, over 7 years of grief he had never let anyone help him carry. She said quietly but clearly, "You've been protecting yourself. And you've let your daughter believe she killed her mother because protecting yourself was more manageable than having that conversation." He did not answer. He didn't have to. Clara stood up. She said, "I'm going to talk to Eliza tomorrow." He looked up at her quickly. "Not instead of you," she said. "You'll need to have your own conversation with her. But someone needs to say it out loud, and it needs to happen now. 7 years is long enough." She left him there with his lamp and his closed ledger, and she went back to Catherine's room, and she lay awake for a long time listening to the Montana wind and thinking about the things that people carry when they believe no one else is able to hold the weight with them. In the morning after breakfast, while James was out with the ranch hands and Owen was in the barn with Copper, Clara knocked on Eliza's door. The conversation took nearly an hour. Clara did not spare the girl the truth, but she delivered it carefully, piece by piece, making sure Eliza could hear each part before moving to the next. She told Eliza what she had told Owen, that a 4-year-old asking for a sister was not the same as causing a death, that the choice Catherine made was her own choice made from love. That blame was a story children told them when grief needed somewhere to live and couldn't find a better address. Eliza fought it. She argued, in the way of someone who has built a belief into the load-bearing structure of their understanding of the world and knows, at some level, that removing it means rebuilding everything. She said, "But if I hadn't asked," she said, "if I'd just been satisfied with Owen," she said, "I should have known better even then." "You were 4 years old," Clara said each time. 4-year-olds are not responsible for what adults decide. The wall held for 40 minutes. Then it didn't. When Eliza cried, she cried the way she did everything, completely, with her full self, without restraint. Clara held her and did not speak and let it happen. And when it was over, Eliza sat back and wiped her face with the back of her hand and looked at Clara with red eyes. She said, "I'm still angry at you for being here. I know. But I'm less angry than I was." "That'll do," Clara said. That evening, James called Eliza into the office and closed the door. Clara took Owen to the barn to check on the kittens. They stayed there for an hour, Owen delivering a detailed monologue about which kitten had which personality and why. And when they came back inside, Eliza was in the kitchen helping Dot with supper, and her eyes were red, but her spine was straighter than Clara had ever seen it. Straighter in a different way, not the rigid straightness of someone bracing against something, but the straightness of someone who has set down a weight they've been carrying for a long time. James came to the kitchen doorway and looked at Clara. Something in his face said more than his words were going to. "Thank you," he said. She said, "You have things to say to Owen, too, I know." He nodded once. "I'll find the right time." "Don't wait too long," she said. "You're good at waiting. It's not always a virtue." He looked at her for a moment with an expression she was beginning to recognize, the look of a man being told something true by someone he had not expected to be told the true things by. "No," he agreed. "I suppose it isn't." It was in the 4th week that Hargrove stopped circling and started striking. The first sign was the fence. A section of the northern boundary, 300 feet of post and rail that separated Diamond Sea grazing land from the unmarked territory Hargrove claimed as a right-of-way, came down overnight, not storm damage. The posts had been cut clean. James found it on a Monday morning and came back to the house with a particular quality of silence that Dot recognized immediately. She said, "How bad?" James said, "2 of the spring calves got through before we found it. One's still missing." Dot looked at Clara. Clara looked at James. "What does he want?" Clara asked. "He wants me to come to him," James said. "He wants me to petition for the fence repair through him, which means acknowledging his right-of-way claim, which means giving ground in the water rights dispute." He paused. "It's how he operates. He doesn't fight directly. He creates situations that cost you more to fight than to accommodate." Clara thought about this. "And if you don't petition him, he'll cut more fence. He'll keep making it expensive to hold the line. Then we hold the line and we make it expensive back." James looked at her. The word had come out naturally. She heard it after it was already in the air and did not take it back. "I said what I meant," she told him. "I'm your partner, remember. Those were my conditions. That means when someone comes for this ranch, they come for both of us." He was quiet for a moment. Then something shifted in his face, not warmly, not sentimentally, but with a kind of recognition, as though a thing he had suspected was now confirmed. "All right," he said. "Then we hold the line." They repaired the fence themselves that afternoon. Clara, working alongside James and 2 ranch hands, learning to drive posts in frozen ground, her hands aching in the cold. Eliza brought them coffee at noon and stood watching for a moment before she went back to the house. Owen helped carry tools without being asked. Nobody talked much. The work was its own conversation, and they were all participating in it. The second strike came a week later. One of the secondary water channels that fed the Diamond Sea's winter livestock supply ran dry overnight. James found it in the morning, not frozen, not dammed by debris, but blocked at the source by a deliberate diversion. Someone had redirected the channel upstream on Hargrove land, sending the water east instead of south. This was more serious than the fence. Winter water for cattle was not optional. James came back to the house and sat at the kitchen table and looked at his hands for a long moment. Clara set coffee in front of him and sat across from him. "He'll say the diversion is within his rights on his own land," James said. "He'll say the downstream impact is our problem to solve. Is it within his rights? On the face of it, there's nothing in the original water agreement that specifically addresses upstream diversions because nobody thought to write it down. My grandfather and his grandfather shook hands on this arrangement and trusted it to hold. Can you get water another way for the cattle? We can haul from the main creek," James said. "It'll take twice the labor and we'll lose ground on everything else." "Then we haul," Clara said, "and we document everything, every instance of interference, every date, every description, every witness. If this goes before a judge, I want a record that goes back to the beginning." James looked at her. "You've been thinking about this." "I've been thinking about what Hargrove said the morning he came here," she said. "He wasn't threatening. He was telling me exactly how he operates. He watches. He waits. He finds the places where the law is ambiguous, and he puts pressure on the ambiguity until someone gives way." She paused. "The way to beat him is not to fight on the ground he's chosen. It's to take the fight somewhere he can't control the rules. The territorial court," James said slowly. "Before he brings it there himself," Clara said. "If we go first, on our terms, with our documentation, we choose the timing and the framing. If we wait for him, we're always responding to what he's already done." James was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "You're right, I know." He almost smiled. He almost smiled more often now. It was a small thing she had started to notice and find herself looking for. It was 3 days later that the man was found. One of the ranch hands, a young fellow named Cullen, who had been with Diamond C for 2 years, was caught by James going through the ranch ledgers in the office at an hour when he had no reason to be there. Cullen was not a subtle liar. Under direct questioning, he admitted that Hargrove's foreman had approached him 6 weeks ago with a proposition, information about the Diamond C's financial position and livestock numbers in exchange for cash. James did not raise his voice. He paid Cullen what he was owed through the day and told him to be off the property by morning. Then he came and told Clara. She said, "How much did he give them?" "Everything in the ledgers through last month," James said. "Which means Hargrove knows exactly how thin our margins are right now. So he knows we can't sustain a long legal fight. He knows we can't afford one with normal resources," Clara said. She had been sitting at the kitchen table going through the documents James had pulled from the office the previous week. The original water agreement, the property surveys, the chain of title going back to his grandfather. She had been reading them for 3 evenings running, going slowly, going carefully. She looked up at him. "But I've been reading your grandfather's agreement with the original Hargrove, and there's something in it that his lawyers may not have noticed." James sat down across from her. "The agreement refers specifically to Diamond Creek and its natural tributaries," she said. "Not just to water flow in general. Your grandfather was specific about that. Which means any diversion Hargrove makes upstream that affects the creek's natural course and its tributaries is arguably a breach of the agreement itself, not an exercise of independent property rights." James stared at her. "Where did you learn to read legal documents?" "My husband's family was in trade," she said. "Harriet Whitmore's opinion of my usefulness aside, I spent 4 years managing a household whose finances I was expected to understand." She paused. "I'm not a lawyer, but I can read, and I can tell you that what Hargrove is doing may not be as legally unassailable as he wants you to believe." James sat back. She watched him process this. She had come to understand, a very good mind, methodical, careful, not quick but thorough. He was the kind of man who arrived at conclusions deliberately and then held them without wavering. "We need a lawyer," he said finally. "Yes, that costs money we're short on right now. It costs less than losing the ranch." He nodded. "All right." The letter came on a Thursday in what Dot calculated was the 6th week of Clara's time at Diamond C, though the days had blurred together in a way that made precise counting difficult. It arrived with the supply rider from Silver Creek, a thick envelope sealed with a wax impression Clara did not recognize. James opened it at the kitchen table with the whole household present, which was not his intention but was the result of it arriving at breakfast when everyone happened to be there. He read it. His face said nothing. He set it down. Dot said, "What is it?" "Hargrove has filed a complaint with the territorial court," James said. "He says our marriage is fraudulent, a legal arrangement designed to circumvent his legitimate business interests. He's requested a hearing to determine whether the marriage should be annulled." The kitchen went very quiet. Owen said, "What's annulled?" Clara said, "It means someone is asking a judge to say our marriage isn't real." "But it is real," Owen said. "You live here, you make breakfast, you know where my boots are. Judges require more than that, sweetheart." Owen looked at her with the uncomplicated certainty of a child who had decided what he believed. "Then the judge is wrong," he said. Clara looked across the table at James. He was looking at her already. His face was doing the thing it did when he was thinking, very still, very controlled, and somewhere behind it something that was not controlled at all. "Judge Aldous Morrison," Clara said, reading from the letter he had passed across to her. "From Helena, 2 weeks from now, in Silver Creek." 2 weeks, James said. "We'll need to be ready," Clara said. He held her gaze. "What does being ready mean?" "It means we go to that courtroom and we tell the truth about exactly what this marriage is and how it has become what it's become." She paused. "And it means we stop living as though we're waiting for someone to decide whether we're real. We make it real, James, whatever it already is. We make it visible." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "There will be questions about our sleeping arrangements." "I know, Clara." He said her name the way he said other things that required precision. "If we are going to present this marriage as genuine in all the ways that matter, then we present it as genuine in all the ways that matter," she said. "Yes." He looked at her for a long moment. "We should talk about this properly." "Yes," she agreed. "We should." That evening, after the children were in bed and Dot had retired, they sat in the kitchen with the lamp between them and talked. It was the longest conversation they had had. Not about the hearing, not about strategy, but about themselves. Two people who had been living in careful proximity for 6 weeks and had been building toward this conversation without quite naming it. James moved his things into Catherine's room the following morning. His shaving kit appeared on the vanity beside Catherine's silver brush. His boots lined up beside hers near the door. The room that had belonged to a dead woman absorbed these small changes and became something else, not erasing what it had been, but becoming layered with something new. That first night they lay in the dark on opposite sides of the bed with a careful distance between them, and Clara looked at the ceiling and listened to James's breathing and felt the absolute strangeness of the ordinary. "Tell me something," James said in the dark. "Something I wouldn't know." Clara thought about it. "I wanted to be a teacher," she said, "when I was a girl. I wanted a classroom full of children who didn't like books, and I was going to make them like books. I thought it would be the most satisfying thing in the world. Why didn't you become one? My father couldn't afford the schooling, and then I married Robert, and his mother thought teaching was beneath the family station. She said my job was to produce heirs and manage the household." She paused. She said it as though it were two different versions of the same task, and neither of them was particularly interesting to her. James was quiet for a moment. "I would have let you teach," he said, "if you'd wanted to. A woman who wants to spend her days making children love books seems like someone worth accommodating." The simple directness of it caught her off guard. She turned her head to look at the shape of him in the dark. "Your turn," she said. He was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then, "I can't read well," he said. "I never had proper schooling. I manage the ranch accounts because I've worked them long enough to know them from memory, and I read documents by going slowly and sometimes asking Dot. But books," he stopped. "I've been making up the stories when I read to Owen at night. Just looking at the pictures and inventing things that seem to match them. He's figured it out. He's too kind to say anything about it." "I could teach you," Clara said. "You could try. It's not as difficult as you think. And you're not as old as you seem to believe. I'm 34 years old. That has no bearing on anything whatsoever." He turned his head to look at her. She could feel his attention in the dark more than see it. "We're partners," she said. "That means I help you with the things you need help with." She paused. "That goes both ways," he said. "All right." They lay in the companionable silence of two people who have said something real to each other and are letting it settle. Somewhere in the night, without either of them intending it, the distance between them narrowed. Clara woke once to find that James's arm was across her waist and her head was near his shoulder, and she lay still in the dark for a moment, feeling the warmth of another person present in the world beside her, solid and certain and unhurried, and then she went back to sleep. The morning of the hearing arrived too quickly and not quickly enough. Clara dressed carefully in her best dress, the dark blue wool she had worn on the train west, which was starting to show its wear but was still the most respectable thing she owned. She pinned her hair twice because her hands were not steady enough the first time. She looked at herself in Catherine's mirror and thought, this is the person who is going to walk into that courtroom. Let her be enough. Downstairs, Dot had made an enormous breakfast that no one could eat. James came in from the barn, checked on the children, checked on Clara, and said nothing unnecessary. He was dressed in his good coat, his hair cut. She had noticed him trim it the previous evening with the focused attention of someone preparing for something important, and he looked like a man who had faced difficult things before and had developed a reliable method for doing so, which was simply to keep moving forward. The children knew something was wrong with the day. Owen ate in silence, which was unprecedented. Eliza sat straight in her chair and looked at her father with an expression that was mostly controlled and only slightly desperate around the edges. "Papa," Eliza said when James stood to leave. "Can we come?" "No. But we could speak for you. We could tell them." This isn't something children need to see, James said firmly. You and Owen stay with Dot, that's my word on it. What if you lose? The question fell into the kitchen like something dropped from a height. James crouched down to Eliza's level. He put his hand on her shoulder. We won't lose, he said, but what if? Then we fight harder, he said. I will not let anyone take Clara from this family, not without everything I have. Clara saw Eliza absorb this. She saw the girl measure it, test its weight, decide it was true. All right, Eliza said. But Papa, she hesitated. Come back. James stood and kissed the top of her head. He did it simply, without ceremony, and Clara saw Eliza's eyes close for just a second, the involuntary response of a child receiving something she needed more than she knew how to say. The ride to Silver Creek was cold and quiet. James drove. Clara sat beside him on the wagon seat. They did not speak much, but they sat close enough that their shoulders touched when the wagon moved over rough ground, and neither of them shifted away. The town hall was full when they arrived. Clara had not anticipated this. She had understood intellectually that this was public, that the hearing would be open to the community. She had not quite visualized what that meant. The benches filled with ranchers and townspeople and merchants and their wives, the buzz of conversation that fell just slightly when she and James walked in, the eyes that moved to her and assessed and moved away and came back again. She had grown up in a city. She knew what it was to be observed. This was different. This was a small community judging one of its own, and she was the variable that required explanation. Victor Hargrove was already there. He sat at a table to the left of the judge's position, flanked by two men in good suits who had clearly come from somewhere with more lawyers than Silver Creek. Hargrove looked at James when they entered, and then at Clara, and his expression was the expression of a man who believes he has already won and is waiting for the formality of confirmation. Beside him, Vivienne Hargrove sat with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes fixed on the floor in front of her. She was 20 years old, dark-haired, and possessed of a quality that Clara recognized immediately, the quality of a person working very hard to disappear while being fully present in a room. Clara had worn that quality herself in Harriet Whitmore's house for 4 years. Judge Aldous Morrison entered and took his seat. He was in his mid-60s with a heavy white mustache and the calm of a man who had presided over difficult situations for long enough to stop being surprised by human nature. He called the room to order, stated the nature of the proceeding in plain terms, and turned to Hargrove's lawyers. The complaint, the lead lawyer began, is simple. Mr. and Mrs. Calloway met on December 10th of this year and married the same day. Mrs. Calloway was destitute at the time of their meeting, having arrived in Silver Creek with no money, no connections, and nowhere to go. Mr. Calloway has been under significant financial and legal pressure related to a water rights dispute with Mr. Hargrove's interests. The marriage is an obvious arrangement of convenience designed to present a false face of domestic stability to this court in order to undermine Mr. Hargrove's legitimate legal standing. He paused for effect. It is fraud, plain and simple, and it makes a mockery of the institution it claims to represent. Morrison looked at Clara. Mrs. Calloway, you may respond. Clara stood. She had decided in the wagon on the way here that she was not going to perform. She was not going to be charming or soft-spoken or strategically tearful. She was going to say what was true and let it stand on its own weight, because the truth was the only thing she had that Hargrove couldn't touch. Everything Mr. Hargrove's lawyer has said about the circumstances of our meeting is accurate, she said. I did meet my husband on December 10th. I was in a desperate situation. Our marriage did begin as a practical arrangement. She paused and let that sit. But here is also what is true. I have lived on the Diamond Sea Ranch for 6 weeks. I have cooked for this household and cleaned for it and learned its rhythms and its needs. I have sat with a 7-year-old boy through nightmares he has had every night since his mother died. I have helped an 11-year-old girl put down 7 years of guilt she was never supposed to carry. I have stood beside my husband when his property was vandalized and his water supply was deliberately diverted, and I have stood beside him because this is my home and those are my children and that is my husband. She looked at Hargrove. I have become part of this family. That is not fraud. That is a marriage in the only sense that has ever mattered. Hargrove's lawyer rose. Mrs. Calloway, do you and your husband share a bedroom? She looked at him steadily. Yes, and this is a recent development, arranged perhaps in anticipation of this hearing? We are a married couple, Clara said. Our domestic arrangements are our own. Morrison held up a hand. Mr. Calloway, do you wish to add to your wife's testimony? James stood. Your Honor, he said. I'd like to call a witness. He paused. Miss Vivienne Hargrove. The room shifted. Hargrove's expression changed for the first time. Something tightened across his face, a brief flash of something that might have been alarm before he sealed it back behind his courtroom composure. Vivienne looked up from the floor. She walked to the front of the room with her hands clasped in front of her and her face very carefully composed. Morrison asked her to state her name and her relationship to the matter at hand. She did so in a quiet, controlled voice. James said, Miss Hargrove, do you wish to marry me? Vivienne's hands tightened around each other. She looked at her father, then she looked at James, then at last she looked at Clara, and something passed between them. Two women who had been used as pieces in other people's strategies, briefly and clearly recognizing each other across a crowded room. No, Vivienne said. I don't wish to marry you, Mr. Calloway. No offense intended to your wife. None taken, Clara said. Vivian looked at Morrison. My father has been attempting to arrange a marriage between Mr. Calloway and myself for 3 years. Not because of any affection or suitability between us, but because our marriage would create a combined property arrangement that would resolve the water rights dispute entirely in my father's favor. She said it cleanly, precisely, as though she had been preparing the words and had decided that if she was going to say them, she was going to say them properly. I have told my father on numerous occasions that I do not wish to marry anyone except Thomas Aldridge of Helena, whom I have known for 2 years. My father has refused to permit this unless he can secure his property interests through another means, Morrison said. And is that the reason for the complaint before this court? Vivienne met her father's eyes. I believe it is, Your Honor. The room was loud for a moment. Morrison gavelled it down. Hargrove rose, Your Honor. His voice was tight. My daughter is a young woman who does not fully understand the complexity of— Sit down, Mr. Hargrove, Morrison said. I will hear your response in turn. He did not sit down immediately. He stood for a moment looking at Vivienne with an expression that Clara watched carefully. It was not only anger. There was something else underneath it. Surprise, and beneath the surprise, the particular pain of a man who has been outmaneuvered by the last person he expected, the one person whose good opinion he still cared about. He sat down. Then the back door of the hall opened. Dot Briggs stood in the doorway. Her expression said very clearly that she had failed in her assigned task and was not particularly apologetic about it. Behind her, Owen pushed past her legs and came down the center aisle with the determined stride of someone who knows exactly what he is doing and is not going to be redirected by anyone. Eliza followed, moving more slowly, her face pale and set with the expression of a person who has made a decision and intends to see it through. James said, Owen, I'm going to talk, Owen said. He reached the front of the room and turned to face the judge with the absolute fearlessness of a child who has not yet learned to be intimidated by institutions or mustaches. Judge Morrison looked at Owen with an expression that was somewhere between startled and something more difficult to name. Son, Morrison said, this is a legal proceeding. I know, Owen said. I want to say something. He looked at Clara and then back at the judge. Clara is my mama. Not because she was born my mama and not because anyone told me she had to be. Because she stayed. He said it with the directness of a child who has sorted something out and is simply reporting his findings. She stayed when I was scared, and she stayed when Eliza was unkind to her, and she stayed when the fence got cut, and she stayed when this. He gestured at the room around him. When all of this happened. His voice did not waver. Staying is what makes someone a mama, so she's my mama. Morrison looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at Eliza. Do you have something to say as well, young lady? Eliza stepped forward. She looked like she was holding herself together by sheer will, and she was, and it was working. She said, I tried to make her leave. When she first came, I was difficult and unkind, and I did things that were designed to make her feel unwelcome in a house she had every right to be in. She paused. She didn't leave. She looked at Morrison directly. Over time, I understood something I could not have said at the beginning, that she wasn't trying to replace my mother. She was trying to know us. Those are different things, and she stayed long enough for me to understand the difference. The room was very quiet. Morrison sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment, and then he looked at Hargrove, and then he looked at his papers with the expression of a man who has heard what he needed to hear, and is now deciding how to proceed with the least amount of wasted time. I have been on this bench for 22 years, he said. I've seen every variety of domestic dispute and property arrangement this territory has to produce. He set his papers down. What I have before me today is a complaint filed by a man whose own daughter has testified against the complaint's underlying purpose. I have testimony from 2 minor children who are not legally required to understand what they have done, but who have in plain terms described the nature of a family. He looked at Clara. Mrs. Calloway, you told me your marriage began as a practical arrangement. Do you maintain that description? Clara stood. It began that way, she said. I would describe what it has become differently. How would you describe it? She thought about James's arm across her waist in the dark. She thought about Owen's hand in hers and Eliza's tears on her shoulder. She thought about standing at a fence line in frozen ground driving posts because this was her home too and she had intended from the first to defend it. I would describe it as a family, she said, built by choice rather than circumstance, and real precisely because of that. Morrison nodded. He looked at Hargrove one more time. Mr. Hargrove, this complaint is without sufficient merit to warrant annulment proceedings. The marriage between James and Clara Calloway is legally valid. He paused, however. I am placing this matter on a 6-month review. I will return to Silver Creek in 6 months' time. If at that time the evidence demonstrates this marriage remains genuine and intact, my ruling stands permanently and this matter is closed. If I find evidence of dissolution or fraud, I will revisit. He looked at both of them. Do you understand? We understand, James said. Clara said, yes, Your Honor. The gavel came down. Hargrove did not look at them as he left. He looked at Vivienne, and she looked back at him with something that was not unkind but was not yielding either, and he went out the door with his lawyers behind him. Owen ran to Clara and wrapped both arms around her waist and pressed his face against her side. I told you, he said. His voice was muffled by her dress. The judge was wrong to think you weren't real, but he figured it out. Clara put her hand on the back of his head. She looked at James over Owen's shoulder. He was looking at her with those storm-gray eyes that had seen too much, and there was something in them she had not seen there before. Not just relief, not just gratitude, but something that had no careful, practical name and was not trying to have one. Eliza came and stood beside them. She did not hug Clara. She stood close enough that their arms touched, which was its own kind of language, and which Clara understood. 6 months, Eliza said quietly. Yes, Clara said, then we prove it for 6 months. Clara looked at the girl, at this fierce, complicated, brave, still grieving child who had crossed a courtroom to say that staying mattered and that knowing someone was different from replacing them. We already have, she said. The ride home from Silver Creek was different from the ride there. Not in any dramatic way, the same horses, the same wagon, the same Montana sky going gray and cold above them. But something had shifted in the quality of the air between them. Some tension that had been present since the morning the hearing summons arrived had finally lifted, and what remained was not quite peace. 6 months of review was not peace, but something that breathed considerably easier. Owen fell asleep against Clara's side before they reached the edge of town, which was entirely consistent with a child who had just delivered unrehearsed testimony before a territorial judge on approximately 4 hours of sleep, and the kind of adrenaline that only children can sustain and then crash from completely. Clara put her arm around him and felt the familiar weight of him settle against her, and she looked out at the passing land and said nothing for a while. Eliza sat up front beside her father. She had not spoken since they left the hall. She sat with her hands in her lap and her eyes on the road ahead, and Clara watched the back of her head and thought about what it costs an 11-year-old girl to walk into a room full of adults and say the things Eliza had said, and mean every word of them. James, she said quietly, so as not to wake Owen. He looked at her over his shoulder. Your daughter is remarkable, Clara said. His jaw moved. Yes, he said, she is. He turned back to the road. But his shoulders were different. Some weight that had been living in them since before Clara arrived had shifted, not gone, but arranged differently, in a way that looked more like something a man could carry without it destroying him. Dot met them in the yard. She took one look at their faces and said, well, we won, Eliza said. She climbed down from the wagon seat. 6-month review. Dot looked at Clara. Clara nodded. Dot made a sound that was not quite a word and not quite a prayer, and went back inside to finish whatever she had been doing, which turned out to be cooking the largest supper the Diamond Sea kitchen had produced since Clara's arrival. There was venison and biscuits and 3 kinds of preserved vegetables and a dried apple pie that Owen, waking when the smell reached him, declared was the best pie in all of Montana Territory and possibly in the entire known world. I say that every time, Dot told him. And every time it's true, Owen said, with the diplomatic sincerity of a child who had learned which compliments landed best and had no intention of abandoning a successful strategy. They ate together around the long table, James, Clara, Eliza, Owen, and Dot, who sat with them as she always did, as someone who was part of the household in a way that did not require explanation or invitation. The conversation was ordinary. The cattle, a letter from a ranch supply company that James needed to respond to. Owen's account of the kitten's current sleeping arrangements, which had apparently shifted in his absence and required discussion. Eliza's observation that one of the barn roof sections was going to need repair before the next serious snow. Ordinary things. Clara listened to them and felt something she could not immediately name, and then she identified it. She felt included. Not as a guest, not as a provisional member of something still being decided, but as a person to whom these ordinary things were simply addressed. As though the ordinariness itself was the point. As though she had always been here, had always been part of the conversation, had always been the one who would know which kittens were sleeping where and why the barn roof mattered. After the children were in bed, James came to find her in the kitchen where she was finishing the washing up. He stood in the doorway for a moment, watching her work. She heard him there and did not turn around. Clara, he said. She turned then. He was standing with his arms at his sides, which was his posture when he was about to say something he had considered carefully and had decided he was going to say regardless of how it was received. I owe you something, he said. You don't owe me anything. I do. He came further into the room and stopped at the table, running one hand along the edge of it in the way he sometimes did when he was thinking. You walked into that courtroom today and you told the truth about what our marriage is and how it started. And you did it without shame and without apology. And you did it in front of everyone in this county. He paused. That took more courage than most things I've seen. I told the truth because it was true, Clara said. That's not courage. That's just accuracy. It's both, he said. He looked at her directly. When I proposed to you on those church steps, I told myself it was a practical matter. A solution to a problem. He paused. I told myself that for about 3 weeks. Then I stopped believing it. Clara set down the cloth she had been holding. What do you mean? I mean that somewhere around the time you sat on the floor of Eliza's room at midnight and talked her through 7 years of grief, he said. I stopped thinking of this as an arrangement. He said the word with a slight edge as though it had been imprecise all along and he was only now getting around to correcting it. I don't know exactly when it happened. I know that when I think about you leaving, not that you will, but the idea of it, it feels like something being taken that I can't replace. Not a housekeeper, not a practical solution. You. The kitchen was very quiet. The fire in the stove ticked and settled. You're not saying this because of the 6-month review, Clara said. No, you're not saying it to perform for a judge who isn't in the room, Clara. His voice had a quality she hadn't heard in it before. Something stripped of its usual management, of the careful control he applied to everything. I'm saying it because it's true and because you have been honest with me from the first day, every day, even when honesty was inconvenient, and I owe you the same. I'm saying it because it's the truest thing I know right now. She looked at him across the kitchen. He looked back at her. Two people standing in a lamplit room in Montana, 7 weeks married, just beginning to understand what they had made from nothing but desperation and honesty and the willingness to show up every day. She said, I told myself the same things at the beginning, that this was practical, that what I needed was a home and what you needed was help, and that if we were both clear-eyed about that, neither of us would be surprised by anything. She paused. I was clear-eyed for about 2 weeks. He made a sound that was the beginning of a laugh, immediately controlled, but there, she heard it and noted it. I'm still frightened, she said. I want you to know that. I'm frightened of being someone who needs people and losing them. I'm frightened of caring about Eliza and Owen and having something happen that takes them away. She met his eyes. I'm frightened of you, of me, of what it would cost me if I lost you, of how much it would cost me now. He crossed the kitchen. He did it simply, without ceremony, and he stopped in front of her and looked at her face in the lamplight. The way he had looked at the young horse in the barn, with that quality of full presence, of having given something his complete and undivided attention. Then he took her face in both hands, the large, careful hands that she had come to know, and he kissed her the way he had not kissed her on their wedding day. Not brief, not proper, not obligatory, real. When they broke apart, she was breathing unevenly, and he rested his forehead against hers, and they stood like that for a moment. Two people who had just crossed a distance they had been slowly crossing for weeks, and who found on the other side of it that the ground was solid. I'm not going anywhere, he said. Neither am I, she said. That night they lay in the dark and talked until nearly 2 in the morning, not about the ranch or the children or Victor Hargrove, but about themselves, trading histories like something valuable, offering pieces of their lives to each other in the way that people do when they have decided to stop holding things back. James told her about his father, who had built Diamond C from 40 acres and a borrowed mule and a particular stubbornness that James had apparently inherited, and who had died when James was 26 with the quiet satisfaction of a man whose life had added up to something worth leaving behind. Clara told him about her mother, who had taught her to read by lamplight using borrowed books and had died when Clara was 12, leaving a gap in the world that nothing had ever quite filled. They talked about small things, foolish things. James admitted he had once spent 3 hours searching the entire property for a calf that had simply walked into the kitchen of this very house and was found standing in front of the stove with the expression of an animal that had found what it was looking for. Clara admitted she had cried on the train west, not from grief, but from the peculiar relief of being in motion going somewhere, even if she didn't yet know where the somewhere was or what it would ask of her. They fell asleep in the middle of a sentence about something Clara would not be able to remember in the morning, and woke tangled together in the easy way of people who have stopped being careful about distance and discovered that without the carefulness, the distance simply closes on its own. Victor Hargrove came to Diamond C 10 days after the hearing. He came alone. No lawyers, no hired men, no careful performance of authority. He rode in on a gray horse in the late afternoon, and Clara saw him coming from the kitchen window and went to find James in the barn. He's coming alone, she said. James straightened from the stall door he had been examining. He looked past her toward the yard. His face did its stillness. Stay with me, Clara said. That wasn't a request she had to make twice. They met Hargrove in the yard. He dismounted without haste and tied his horse to the post by the gate, and he looked at both of them for a moment with the expression of a man who has thought carefully about what he is going to say and is deciding, in the last few seconds before he says it, whether it is still what he means. He looked older than he had in the courtroom. Or perhaps Clara was simply seeing him differently now, outside the context of official proceedings, without the armor of lawyers and legal language arranged around him. He was in his mid-50s, broad through the shoulders, a man who had worked hard his whole life and had the body to show for it. His face was weathered, and his eyes were the particular blue of a cold sky, clear and hard and capable, she thought, of more than he usually let them show. Calloway, he said. He nodded at James. Then he looked at Clara. Mrs. Calloway. Mr. Hargrove, Clara said. He was quiet for a moment, looking at them both. Then, I'm not here to threaten you. All right, James said. And I'm not here to negotiate. His voice was flat and direct, the voice of a man who had decided to dispense with the preamble. I'm here because my daughter came to me 3 nights ago and said something to me that I've been sitting with since, and I find I can't continue with what I've been doing without saying what needs to be said first. Clara had not expected this, but she had expected something. She had watched Vivienne leave the courtroom that day. Not with her father, but slightly ahead of him, which was its own statement about where things stood between them, and she had thought, that young woman is going to have a conversation with him tonight. Whatever it cost her, she is going to have it. She had been right. She said nothing now. She waited. Hargrove looked at James. "I've been working this territory for 30 years, he said. "My father left me nothing. No land, no money, no name that meant anything to anyone. Everything I have I built from the ground up. Every acre, every water right, every agreement and arrangement that keeps this operation running." He paused. "I built it because I was afraid. Afraid of going back to having nothing. Afraid that if I stopped pushing, if I stopped acquiring, everything I'd built would start to slip away." He said it plainly, as though it was not a confession but simply a fact he had finally gotten around to recognizing. "That fear made me into the kind of man who uses his daughter as a piece in a game she never agreed to play." James's expression did not change, but something in him shifted. Clara could feel it more than see it. "I know our marriage is real," Hargrove said to Clara. He met her eyes without looking away. "I knew it before the hearing. I challenged it because it was the only legal lever I had left. Because you standing here in this yard with this family made me." He pressed his mouth together briefly. "I don't apologize easily, Mrs. Calloway, but I was wrong." Clara looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the morning he had ridden into this yard and called her empty. She thought about what that word had done to her. Not because it was new, she had heard it from Harriet Whitmore, had carried it across 2,000 miles, but because it had been said here, in the yard of her own home, in front of people she was trying to build something with. She thought about what it had cost her to stand straight and answer him that morning. She said, "Why did your wife leave?" The question clearly surprised him. His expression shifted. She said, "You told James in the courtroom that you built everything alone after your wife left. Vivienne has no mother at home. You've been managing that too on your own for a long time." Hargrove was quiet for a moment. "Eleanor couldn't stay," he said finally. "Same reason as your husband's first wife, more or less. The isolation, the winters. She was from Virginia and she tried, and then one spring she stopped trying and went back east." He paused. "I don't blame her." He said it as though he had practiced saying it until it was true. "I wasn't easy to live with. I'm not easy now. I was considerably harder then." "And Vivienne," Clara said. "She grew up without her mother." "Yes, and you tried to manage that, and manage your own grief, by controlling her future, by making her future part of your plan." His jaw tightened, then it released. "Yes," he said. "That's exactly what I did." Clara looked at James. James said nothing, but the look on his face was that of a man who recognized something in what Hargrove had just described. She turned back to Hargrove. "Vivienne is 20 years old," Clara said. "She has a man she loves and a future she has chosen for herself. She came to that courtroom and she told the truth under enormous pressure, knowing it would cost her something with you. That is not a woman who needs managing. That is a woman who needs permission to live her own life." She paused. "And I think you know that now." Hargrove looked at her steadily. "I know that now, do you?" "I'm working on knowing it," he said. "There's a difference between knowing something and having fully made peace with it." He said it precisely, without self-pity. "I'm at the knowing stage. The peace is still ahead." The honesty of that surprised her. She had expected defensiveness or performance or the careful retreat of a man who had decided to concede the minimum necessary. What she got was a man being specific about exactly where he was. She said, "Vivienne told me in the courtroom that she would not marry Thomas Aldridge unless you gave your blessing, that she would not take that happiness at the cost of her relationship with you." "I know what she said." "Then you understand what she's asking you for." He looked at the ground for a moment. Then he looked back up. "I'm going to Helena next month," he said. "I'm going to meet this Aldridge. If he's what Vivienne says he is, and I suspect he is, because Vivienne has always had better judgment than I've given her credit for, then I'm going to do what I should have done 2 years ago and let my daughter make her own choice." Clara nodded. "That's all she's ever wanted." Hargrove turned to James. "The water rights," he said. "I've spoken with my lawyer. The diversion upstream is going back to its original course. My men will handle it by end of week." He paused. "The fence line you repaired in the north section. I've had my men look at the boundary surveys. Your grandfather's line was correct. The right-of-way was ours to claim but not ours to exploit. I was wrong on that as well." James held out his hand. Hargrove looked at it, then he took it. The handshake was brief and without embellishment. Two men who were not going to be friends, who had done each other genuine harm, who had nonetheless reached an understanding that would hold because both of them had decided it would hold. Hargrove untied his horse. He mounted with the ease he always did, and he paused at the gate and looked at Clara one more time. "You're not what I expected," he said. "No one ever is," she said. He nodded once, and he rode north, and she watched him go until the gray horse disappeared into the afternoon light and the sound of hooves faded into nothing. James stood beside her. After a moment he said, "Did you know he would come?" "No," Clara said. "But I knew Vivienne would talk to him. I could see it in her face in that courtroom. She wasn't just testifying against him. She was giving him a chance to be better than he'd been. That's what children do for parents who are still worth the effort." He looked at her. "You understand people very well." "I've had good reason to learn to," she said. "When you've been on the wrong end of being misunderstood for long enough, you start paying very close attention." He put his arm around her shoulders. She let herself lean into him, slightly in the cold afternoon air. They stood like that for a moment, looking at the empty road north, and it was enough. The news about the pregnancy arrived on a Tuesday morning in the 4th month. Clara had been kneading bread dough when the nausea came. Not sudden, but building, the way it had been building for 3 mornings running, which she had been attributing to various other causes, because the actual cause was something her mind kept approaching and then retreating from. She set her hands flat on the table and breathed through it carefully, and Dot turned from the stove and looked at her with the directness of a woman who had seen this particular situation enough times to recognize it without requiring confirmation. "When was your last monthly?" Dot asked. Clara counted back. The counting took longer than it should have because her mind kept slipping sideways. She had been busy. She had been managing a household and a legal crisis and a 6-month review and the particular ongoing project of learning to be a wife to a man who was still learning to be known. 11 weeks, she said finally. Perhaps 12. Dot set down the spoon she was holding. Well, she said. Then she sat down at the kitchen table and looked at Clara with something that was entirely warm despite its absolute frankness. "Congratulations," she said. "You're going to have a baby." Clara stood very still with her flour-dusted hands flat on the table. The world did not spin. It simply rearranged itself around this new fact, settling everything into a different configuration than it had occupied a minute ago. She had spent 4 years of her first marriage believing that a child might come and watching months pass without one and finally, reluctantly, accepting the possibility that it would not happen for her. Harriet Whitmore had said the word barren with the certainty of a verdict that had already been handed down and recorded. Clara had argued against it in her own mind but had never been entirely sure, because uncertainty is what absence produces and she had been living in absence for a long time. Now she was entirely sure, and the certainty felt like something she had always deserved and had simply been waiting, without knowing it, to receive. She felt in rapid succession, wonder, then joy, then a swift cold wave of understanding about what this information was going to do to James. "Where is he?" Clara asked. "North pasture," Dot said. Clara wiped her hands on her apron. She went to find him. She found him at the fence line near the creek, checking the posts that he and the ranch hands had reset 2 weeks ago. He heard her coming across the frozen ground and turned, and something in her face made him go very still. He came toward her. "What's wrong?" "Nothing is wrong," she said. She stopped in front of him and looked at his face, the weathered, careful face that she had come to know so well in 4 months, the face that had slowly, over weeks, learned to show her what was happening behind it. She said, "I'm going to have a baby." The stillness that came over him was different from his ordinary stillness. It was the stillness of a man whose processing has outrun his expression, who is somewhere inside himself running very fast through a number of things he cannot yet say. She watched his face go pale. She had known it would. She had known it on the walk across the frozen field, had been bracing for it. This was not news that would hit James Calloway simply as joy. It would hit him as joy and terror and grief all at once, tangled together the way things get tangled when a man has watched one woman die making exactly this choice, when the memory of it is still present enough to reach out and close around anything that resembles it. "James," she said. His jaw was tight. His eyes were on her face and they held something she had not seen in them since those first weeks, the quality of a man bracing himself against an impact he could see coming and could not stop. "Listen to me," she said. She took both his hands in hers, which surprised him enough to make him focus on her rather than on whatever he was running through in his mind. "Listen to me carefully. I am not Catherine." His breath came out unsteadily. "I am not fragile," she said. "I am not sick. The doctor in Philadelphia found nothing physically wrong with me. What he found was unexplained difficulty, not a specific condition that made pregnancy dangerous. And I am standing in front of you in the cold telling you this because I am strong enough to stand in the cold and tell you things." She held his gaze without looking away. "This baby is coming because of us, because of what we have built together, and I intend to be here on the other side of it. I intend that with everything I have." He pulled her against him. She felt the full force of him, the fear in it, the relief, the grief that never fully went away, all of it pressing into her shoulder, and she held on and let it be what it was, let him feel it without trying to manage it for him. "I can't lose you," he said. His voice was very quiet. "I know that's not a rational thing to say, and I know you can't promise me what isn't yours to promise, but I cannot go through that again. I cannot stand at the end of something and try to figure out what I'm apologizing for. I'm not promising you I won't die someday," she said into his coat. "I promised you I wouldn't choose to leave. This is me not choosing to leave. This is me choosing to stay so completely that we are going to have a child together." She pulled back slightly so she could see his face. "That is the opposite of leaving, James. That is the most permanent kind of staying there is." He looked at her for a long time. She saw him working through it, the fear and the memory and the grief, and she saw him do what she had watched him do before, make the choice to be present instead of protected, to move towards something instead of away from it. "All right," he said finally. His voice was steadier. All right, she said back. They walked back to the house together, and the creek ran beside them beneath its ice, and the mountains stood where they had always stood, and Clara thought, "We are still here, both of us, still here." The children received the news with the predictable difference of their natures. Owen, informed at supper that he was going to have a brother or sister in approximately 5 months, immediately and without pause, declared himself the future teacher of everything the baby would need to know, and began composing a mental list aloud that appeared to include horsemanship, the proper naming of constellations, the correct identification of which barn kittens had the best personalities, and the specific location of every good hiding place on the Diamond Sea property. Eliza said nothing for a long moment. She set her fork down carefully and looked at the table, and Clara watched her face and recognized what was moving across it before it fully arrived. She said, before Eliza could speak, "I know what you're thinking." Eliza looked up. "You're thinking about your mother," Clara said. "And you're thinking about what happened when Owen came." Eliza's face was very controlled. "Yes, I want you to hear something," Clara said, "and I want you to hear it not as a reassurance but as a fact. I am not your mother. I am not sick. This is not the same situation. Your mother made a choice that had a terrible outcome, and that outcome came from a specific medical vulnerability that she had and that I do not have. Do you understand the difference between those two things?" "You can't know for certain," Eliza said. She said it carefully, not as an accusation but as the observation of a girl who had learned to think carefully about the things she was told. "No," Clara said. "I can't know anything with certainty. Nobody can." She looked at the girl steadily. "But I need you to let me do this without carrying the weight of your fear on top of everything else. I need you to trust that I know my own body better than anyone else does. Can you do that for me?" Eliza was quiet. She looked at her father. James looked back at her. "I'll try," Eliza said finally. She said it precisely, the way she said things she meant precisely, not as a comfort or a performance, as a real commitment. "I'll try." That night Clara found Eliza in the parlor, sitting with a ball of gray wool in her lap and 2 knitting needles in her hands, working at something very small with the focused intensity she brought to everything. Clara stopped in the doorway and looked at the tiny fabric taking shape between Eliza's careful hands. Eliza said, without looking up, "I learned from Dot last week. She said all babies need warm feet and that the time to make things for them is before they arrive, not after, because after there's no time for anything." Clara said, "Yes. That sounds exactly like Dot." Eliza turned the needles and the stitches slid and settled. She said, "I pulled this out 3 times already. I keep getting the tension wrong." "It takes practice," Clara said. "Yes," Eliza said. She kept knitting. Clara went to bed, and she thought about what it meant that Eliza, without being asked, without announcing it, had simply sat down and started making something for the baby. That was its own kind of answer. That was Eliza's way of saying, "I'll try." The months that followed had a quality of fullness that Clara had not known in her adult life. Not ease. The work of the ranch did not get easier as her body changed, though James and Dot and even Eliza managed with careful subtlety to redistribute the heavier tasks without ever making her feel as though she were being protected in a way that diminished her. Not peace. The 6-month review hung over everything like weather that might come or might not, and required that they live their lives with both authenticity and a certain awareness of being observed. But fullness. The sense that each day contained things that mattered and people who were there, and a life that was being genuinely lived. Spring came properly in April, melting the snow from the upper pastures and turning Diamond Creek from a murmur under ice to a full-voiced running thing that Owen spent considerable time investigating with sticks and the scientific rigor of a boy who had decided the creek was interesting and that interesting things deserved thorough study. The calves that had been born in the difficult cold of February were running now, tentative and comic on new legs. The first kitchen garden showed its early tentative green, which Dot watched with the satisfaction of someone whose predictions about soil and timing had once again been correct. James began his reading lessons. This had been Clara's idea and his agreement, and it proceeded with the particular dynamic of a man who was accustomed to being competent at everything he attempted, now attempting something he was not competent at. He was a difficult student. Not because he wasn't intelligent, he was very intelligent, but because he had spent 34 years building an alternative relationship with text that relied on memory and pattern recognition, and undoing those habits required a different kind of work than simply learning something new. He was also genuinely embarrassed by his difficulty, which he would not admit but which Clara could see clearly enough. She addressed this by being entirely matter-of-fact about it. She treated each reading session the way Dot had treated her first cooking lessons. Here is a thing, here is how it works, here is where you went wrong, try again. No sentiment, no false encouragement, no pretending the error hadn't happened. James responded to this approach better than to any other she could have tried, because it was the same approach he used for everything else he did, and he recognized it as respect rather than accommodation. By May, he could read Owen's storybooks aloud with only occasional stumbling. By June, he read them smoothly, confidently, with the ease of someone who has stopped having to think about the mechanics and can start attending to the story itself. One evening, Clara stood in the hallway outside Owen's room and listened to James's voice moving through the words of a story about a boy who went to sea, and she felt something that was not pride exactly, but was close to it. The particular satisfaction of watching someone discover that a door they believed was closed to them was not closed at all, and had never been. Owen, lying in bed listening, said at the end of the chapter, "Papa, you sound different when you read." "Different how?" James asked. "Like you're having fun," Owen said. A silence. Then, "Maybe I am." He came out of the room and found Clara in the hallway, and she did not say anything because she did not need to, and they walked downstairs together in the easy way of people who have become fluent in each other's silences and found them comfortable. A letter arrived from Helena in early June. The handwriting on the envelope was unfamiliar, and Clara opened it at the kitchen table with Dot looking over her shoulder with the unabashed curiosity of someone who had been in this household long enough to feel entitled to know what arrived in it. It was from Vivienne Hargrove. She wrote that she was well, and that her father had come to Helena in April, as he had promised, and had met Thomas Aldridge. She wrote that the meeting had gone. She used the word adequately, which Clara suspected was doing considerable diplomatic work, and that Victor Hargrove had given his blessing with the quality of a man who was giving it because he had finally understood something rather than because he had been forced into it. She wrote that she was to marry Thomas Aldridge on the 15th of July. She wrote, "I know we have no particular claim on each other's goodwill, Mrs. Calloway, but I find I cannot move forward into this next part of my life without acknowledging that it would not have been possible without what happened in that courtroom. You stood in front of my father when very few people did. You gave me an example of what it looked like to hold your ground. That mattered more than you know." She wrote at the end, "I think you are exactly what that ranch needs. I hope you are happy there. I believe you are." Clara folded the letter and held it for a moment. Then she set it on the table and went back to what she had been doing, and she did not try to explain what she was feeling because some things are better left to simply exist in the chest where they belong. The summer heat descended on Montana in July with the efficiency of something that has been waiting all year to make its point. Clara, now 6 months along and feeling every degree of it, spent the hottest hours of the afternoon inside with a fan and the particular patience of someone who has decided that being uncomfortable is not the same as being incapable. James had stopped hovering approximately 6 weeks after he started, at Clara's direct request. She had said, "You're treating me as though I'm made of something fragile, and I need you to stop because it makes me feel fragile and I am not." He had looked at her for a moment, and then he had said simply, "You're right," and he had stopped. This had required visible effort on his part, the effort of a man whose fear had to be overridden consciously every time by the knowledge that she had asked him for something and he intended to give it to her. The baby was active. It communicated its presence with a regularity that Owen found endlessly fascinating. He would press his ear to Clara's side at unpredictable moments, listening with intense concentration, then report his findings with scientific seriousness. "The baby kicked 3 times in a row this morning," he reported one July breakfast. "I think it's practicing something." "Practicing what?" Eliza asked. "Being born," Owen said. Eliza looked at him. Then she looked at Clara. Something moved across her face that was not quite a smile, but was definitely moving in that direction. The letter from Judge Morrison arrived at the beginning of July, 3 weeks before his scheduled 6-month visit. It was brief and formal, stating that he would be calling at Diamond C Ranch on the 20th of July as part of his circuit through the territory, and that he wished to discuss the status of the Calloway marriage as per the conditions of his January ruling. Clara read it at breakfast and set it down. James said, "We have 3 weeks." "We've had 6 months," Clara said. She looked around the table, Owen eating with his fork in the wrong hand as usual, Eliza reading with a book propped against the sugar bowl, Dot moving between the stove and the table with the efficiency of long practice. "This is what we have. This is what we show him." July 20th was a Tuesday. Morrison arrived in a hired buggy in the early afternoon, looking exactly as he had in the courtroom. The heavy white mustache, the careful eyes, the manner of a man whose job required him to look at the world as it actually was, rather than as people chose to present it. He climbed down and looked at Clara with what appeared to be genuine surprise. "Mrs. Calloway," he said, "you're quite pregnant." 7 months, Clara said. "Give or take." "I see." He looked at her for a moment longer than was strictly necessary, and then something in his expression shifted, a small, controlled thing but present. "I suppose that answers 1 or 2 of my questions already." Dot served coffee and the dried apple pie that had become the Diamond C's primary diplomatic instrument in the months since Clara's arrival. Morrison sat at the kitchen table and asked his questions with the thoroughness of someone doing a real job rather than a procedural formality. About their daily life, about the children, about the work of the ranch and how they managed it together, about how the water rights situation had resolved itself. James answered directly, without embellishment. Clara answered the same way. Morrison listened to both of them and made occasional notes and drank his coffee and ate his pie with the focused appreciation of a man who had been eating in boarding houses for 2 weeks. Then he asked for the children. Eliza came in first and sat down across from the judge with the composure of a girl who had already testified before him once and had concluded that judges were manageable if you were honest and did not waste their time. Morrison said, "Miss Calloway, how would you describe your relationship with your stepmother?" Eliza considered this with visible care. She said, "Complicated, when it started." She said as without apology, as a simple statement of fact. "I didn't want her here. I made that clear in various ways, none of which were particularly kind." "Did she respond to that?" "She didn't leave," Eliza said. That was her response. She paused, choosing her words with precision. "Over time I understood something I couldn't have said at the beginning, that she wasn't trying to replace my mother. She was trying to know us. Those are different things, very different things." And she stayed long enough for me to understand the difference, which is probably the most important thing anyone has ever done for me. Morrison was quiet for a moment. Then he turned to Owen, who had been sitting beside Clara with her hand in his. Owen, Morrison said, what would you like me to know? Owen thought about this with visible seriousness. He said, I would like you to know that Clara made my papa read to me, and that now he can, and it changed how our house sounds at night. He said it with the certainty of a child identifying something specific and true, something he had thought about and arrived at carefully. Houses sound different when people read in them. Ours sounds better now than it ever did before. Morrison looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at Clara. He said, Mrs. Calloway, when I ruled in your favor in January, I had genuine uncertainty. The circumstances were unusual, and the complaint had some legal merit, even if the motivations behind it were poor. He paused. I placed you on a 6-month review because I wanted to be sure before I made a permanent ruling. He looked at her directly, and his expression was the expression of a man who has seen enough of the world to know the real thing when it sits in front of him. I am sure now. This marriage is genuine in every sense that the law intends and in every sense that matters beyond the law. I will be filing a final ruling removing all conditions and declaring this matter permanently and irrevocably closed. Clara felt the words settle into her chest and stay there, the way things settle when they are exactly right and have found exactly where they belong. Thank you, Your Honor, she said. He looked at her with something that was not quite a smile but was warmer than his official expression. Don't thank me. You did the work. He looked at James, both of you. After Morrison left, James stood in the yard and watched the buggy go until it disappeared north into the afternoon. Clara came and stood beside him. The day was warm, genuinely warm in the way of Montana July, with a sky so blue it seemed almost impractical, almost too much of a thing. James looked at her. It's done, he said. It's done. He put his arm around her shoulders. She leaned into him, the familiar weight and warmth of him solid beside her. From inside the house, she could hear Owen telling Dot about the conversation with the judge, his voice running at its characteristic pace, filling the afternoon with its particular music. She could hear Eliza responding with occasional precision, correcting Owen's account at the points where it had drifted from strict accuracy, which were several. Their house, their sounds. It's done, James said again quietly, as though he needed to hear it a second time to fully believe it. Clara said, now we just live. The pain started on a Thursday morning in late August, 3 weeks before Clara had expected it. She was at the kitchen table, writing a letter to the school in Silver Creek about the possibility of a teaching position in the spring, a possibility James had raised one evening, and Clara had spent 3 weeks trying not to want too much before allowing herself to want it completely when the first contraction came, not dramatic or sharp. A slow, insistent tightening that started at her back and moved forward, and she set her pen down carefully and breathed through it until it passed. She picked up the pen. The second one came 12 minutes later. Dot came into the kitchen, looked at her, and said, how long? That's the second one, Clara said. Dot took the pen out of her hand with the efficiency of someone taking charge of a situation that has now become hers to manage. Go upstairs, she said. I'll send for James and for Mrs. Hartwell down the road. I'm 3 weeks early. Babies have their own timing. Dot was already moving, already purposeful, already running the household operation that a birth required. This is not new information. Go upstairs. Clara went upstairs. She changed into the nightgown she had washed and set aside 2 weeks ago in anticipation of exactly this, and she sat on the edge of the bed while the third contraction came and went, and she breathed through it, and she thought about all the things she had promised herself she would do, and all the things she intended to see. She thought about a church step in Silver Creek and 17 cents. She thought, I have come a very long way from there. James came in from the north field moving faster than she had ever seen him move, still in his work clothes, still smelling of outside and horses and cold air. He came through the bedroom door and stopped when he saw her, and she saw in his face everything she had expected. The fear, the memory, the thing that Catherine's death had carved into him so deeply that it would never be entirely gone, and she held out her hand. He came and took it. Sit with me, she said. He sat on the edge of the bed beside her. She held his hand and felt the tension in it, and the effort he was making to hold the tension without letting it become anything she would need to manage on top of everything else she was already managing. This is different, she said. You know it's different. I know, he said. His voice was controlled and careful, and underneath both of those things was something that was neither. Stay with me, she said. Don't go stand outside the door the way you did with Catherine. Stay in the room with me. He looked at her. She looked back at him. She saw him remember. She could see the moment it moved across his face, the memory of a different room and a different woman and a door he had stood outside of while something terrible happened on the other side. And she saw him make the choice, deliberately and with full knowledge of what it would cost him, to be present instead of protected. I'll stay, he said. Mrs. Hartwell arrived with her daughter within the hour, and Dot ran the room with calm command, and the labor moved through its hours with the absolute authority of something that has its own schedule and is simply proceeding according to it. It was long. 6 hours, which Dot said afterward was not long for a first birth, but which contained for Clara a quality of endlessness that she suspected she would never be able to describe accurately to anyone who hadn't been in that room. James stayed. He held her hand through every contraction, his grip steady and warm and certain, and he did not look away and he did not go stand in the hallway. Clara felt this as something of great importance, felt it as a man keeping a promise he had made to himself, the promise of being present for something he had failed to be present for before, of not letting the past determine what he was capable of in the present. She heard Owen in the hallway at one point, his voice low and worried, asking Eliza what was happening. She heard Eliza's voice, calm and certain. She's fine, she's strong, this is what it sounds like. And Clara heard, in those few words, a girl who had decided to believe that the woman she had tried to drive away and had instead chosen to keep was going to be all right, and who was saying so as though saying it would help make it true. The baby came at 8:30 in the evening with the sun still low and gold through the bedroom window. A girl. Dot placed her on Clara's chest, and the crying stopped the moment she arrived there. The baby opened her eyes, dark, unfocused, absolutely and completely present, and looked at Clara with the concentrated attention of someone encountering something entirely new and finding it acceptable. "Oh," Clara said. "Hello?" James was not crying. He was beyond crying. He was making a sound that was not quite a word, sitting with both hands pressed over his mouth, looking at his daughter with an expression Clara had never seen on his face before and thought she would remember for the rest of her life. "Is she?" He started. "She's perfect," Dot said. "Both of them." James reached out and touched the baby's face with one careful finger, the way he touched things he was afraid of damaging. The baby turned toward the touch with the instinct of something that has no experience yet and therefore no fear, only the simple ability to move toward warmth. Eliza came to the doorway eventually, having apparently decided that she had waited a sufficient and dignified amount of time. She stopped in the doorway and looked at Clara and the baby, and her face did the thing it did when she was feeling something she had not yet found words for. Something that was moving through her, rearranging things, making her into a slightly different version of herself than she had been before. Owen appeared beside her. He looked at the baby with the expression of a child confronting something wonderful and slightly overwhelming, something too big for the moment and requiring processing time. "She's so small," he said. "You were this small," James told him. His voice was rough in the way of someone who has been holding themselves together and is only now allowing the holding to relax slightly. Owen considered this with visible effort. Then he looked at Clara. "What's her name?" Clara looked at James. He looked back at her. This was a conversation they had circled around, not fully, not with certainty. They had talked near it the way you talk near something that needs the right moment, the right room, the right weight of occasion before it can be properly said. She looked at the baby in her arms. The baby had her eyes closed now, settled and content against her mother's chest, making the small sounds of someone who has arrived somewhere and found it exactly right. "Grace," Clara said. "Her name is Grace." "Just Grace?" Owen asked. Clara looked at James. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she said, "Grace Catherine Calloway." The silence that followed was the kind that has weight, not empty weight, full weight, the weight of something meaningful filling a space completely. James made a sound she had never heard from him. She looked at him and saw that he was, after all, crying, quietly, without apology, without trying to stop it, looking at his daughter with tears moving down his face unregarded. Eliza said, "Catherine." She said it like she was feeling it for shape, trying the weight of it in her mouth. "You named her for Mama." "Yes," Clara said. "Why?" Clara held the baby and looked at Eliza and thought about how to say what was true in a way that was also complete. She said, "Because your mother was here before me. She built this family. She made your father who he is, and she made you who you are, and she made it possible for Owen to exist." She paused. "I didn't come here to erase her. I didn't come here to take her place or undo what she was. I came here to continue what she started, to take care of what she left. Her name belongs on this baby. She earned it, and it's ours to give." Eliza's face had gone very still. Something in her was working through what she had just heard, arranging it carefully in relation to everything else she knew, everything she had spent 7 years believing and had slowly, over the past months, been learning to revise. Then she crossed the room and she looked at the baby, and she reached out, carefully with the same precision she brought to everything, and touched Grace's hand with one finger. The baby's fingers curled around Eliza's finger with the unreasonable grip of newborns, which does not know it is remarkable but is remarkable anyway, has always been remarkable, will always be. Eliza looked at her half-sister. She said very quietly, "Hello, Grace." Owen came and pressed in beside Eliza to look. He said, "I'm going to teach her everything." He paused, reconsidering. "Well, almost everything. Some things she should probably figure out herself." James laughed. He laughed with his whole chest, the way he laughed when he forgot to manage it, the unguarded laugh that Clara had come to love most because it belonged to the version of him that had stopped being careful. He put his hand on Owen's shoulder and his other hand on Eliza's, and he looked at Clara over the heads of his children. She looked back at him. There was nothing to say that was better than what was already in the room. The weeks that followed arranged themselves around Grace with the particular logic of a household reorganized by a small person who cannot speak but communicates extremely clearly. Grace was opinionated about warmth. She was committed to being held. She had specific feelings about the timing of meals and expressed these feelings with volume and persistence and absolutely no concern for anyone else's schedule. Owen was fascinated by all of it. He studied Grace with the attention he gave to the barn kittens and Copper the horse, and everything else he considered interesting enough to deserve thorough observation, reporting his findings to anyone within earshot. She recognizes Clara's voice, he told James one morning at breakfast. When Clara talks, she turns her head. She knows who it belongs to. Babies learn their mothers first, Dot said from the stove. Owen absorbed this. Then, is that why she knows Clara? Because Clara is her mother? Dot looked at him. Why do you think? Owen thought about it with the visible seriousness he brought to questions he considered important. He said, I think she knows Clara for the same reason I know Clara. Because Clara is there. He paused. That's what knowing someone is. That they're there when you need them to be and still there when you don't. Dot looked at him for a long moment. Then she went back to the stove without answering, which was her particular way of indicating that something had been said that was complete as it was and did not need adding to. The official document from the territorial court arrived in September, as Morrison had said it would. His final ruling, stamped and filed, 3 pages of legal language said, in its careful formal way, what he had already told them standing in their kitchen in July. The marriage between James and Clara Calloway was declared permanently valid, all conditions removed, the matter closed in every legal respect the territory could bring to bear on the question. Clara set it on the table beside the sugar bowl, where Eliza would see it in the morning, because Eliza was the one who had stood in a courtroom and earned the right to know it was finished. Then she picked up Grace and went to find James in the barn. He was brushing Copper down by the light of a hanging lamp when she came in. He looked at her face and then at Grace sleeping against her shoulder. Is it the document? He asked. Yes, she said. It's done. Permanently and irrevocably, in the language of the territorial court. He set down the brush. He came to her and looked at Grace for a moment. The sleeping face, the small fists, the particular quality of absolute peace that only sleeping babies have. And then he looked at Clara. How are you? He asked. She considered this honestly. She said, I'm here. I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. I think I've been working my way toward this specific place for a long time without knowing it. He put his arm around her, careful of the baby between them, and she leaned into him in the lamplight of the barn, while Copper shifted and settled nearby, and the ranch night settled around them. In the morning, Eliza came downstairs and saw the document on the table and read it standing up, still in her nightgown, before she said anything to anyone. Then she folded it precisely and set it back where it had been and went to help Dot with breakfast. She didn't say anything about it until the meal was nearly finished, and then she looked at Clara and said, It's really over then. It's really over, Clara said. Eliza nodded once with the precision she brought to agreements she meant completely. Good, she said, and went back to her breakfast. Owen put his boots in Eliza's room 2 days later as an experiment in what would happen. What happened was that Eliza confiscated them and arrived at breakfast carrying them with the air of someone who has made a decision and is presenting it without apology. Owen arrived behind her in sock feet making his case. Clara said, Owen, did you put your boots in Eliza's room? As an experiment, Owen said carefully. Eliza set the boots on the floor. She said to Owen, an experiment that is over. Owen put his boots on. He looked at Grace, asleep in the cradle that had been moved to the kitchen so Clara could keep an eye on her while she worked. He said, She's smiling. Babies that age don't smile, Eliza. Gas. It looks like smiling, Owen said. He looked at Clara. Clara, is she smiling? She might be, Clara said. We can decide she is if you like. Owen nodded seriously. I decide she is. He looked at Eliza. She's smiling because she knows she has a good family. Eliza looked at him. She looked at Clara. She looked at her father. Something moved through her face that was not controlled and not performed and not borrowed from anyone else's way of feeling things. Something that was entirely hers, earned through months of hard and honest work. She said, yes, she does. Outside, Diamond Creek was running clear and full. The mountains were going gold at their peaks where the first autumn cold had touched them, burning the high places with color before the snow returned to stay. The ranch yard was ordinary and busy and entirely itself. Fences holding, cattle settled, smoke rising from the chimney of a house where people were having breakfast and arguing about boots and deciding whether babies could smile. Clara Whitmore, who had arrived in this territory with 17 cents in a carpet bag and the particular desperation of someone who has run out of everything else, sat at her kitchen table with her daughter sleeping in the cradle beside her, and her family moving around her in the ordinary morning way of people who belong to the same place and have stopped needing to think about it. She did not think about Philadelphia. She did not think about Harriet Whitmore, or the words that had been said to her, or the long, cold journey that had brought her here. Those things had happened. They had shaped her, had made her who she was, had sent her down roads she would not have chosen until the roads ran out and left her standing in the snow with 17 cents and nowhere to go. She looked at Grace. She looked at Owen demonstrating something to Eliza that Eliza was pretending not to find interesting. She looked at James, who caught her looking and held her gaze across the room with those storm-gray eyes that had seen too much and were learning, slowly, to see differently. She thought, this was always where the road was going. I just had to run out of everything else first to find it. Between them was everything they had built and everything they were still building, and the particular steadiness of two people who had chosen each other not from ease but from honesty, and had found that honesty, over time, became something warmer than either of them had been careful enough to expect. Grace slept on. The creek ran. The mountains held their ground.